Hello story seekers. Welcome to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep. And I'm here to deliver. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. The story I'm about to tell you isn't one passed down or found in dusty archives. It's mine from a time not long ago, but one I'll never forget. My name is Colin, and for almost 5 years, I worked as a night security guard. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it paid the bills and gave me the quiet solitude I thought I craved. The events I'm sharing tonight happened during my second year on the job, a time when I believed I had seen and heard it all. That belief, as it turned out, couldn't have been further from the truth. This story begins in a sprawling corporate building in the heart of the city. It wasn't one of those modern glass skyscrapers. Instead, it had a more dated charm: red brick walls, narrow hallways, and the kind of creaking floorboards you'd expect in a structure that had seen decades of wear. By day, the building bustled with office workers, the faint hum of printers, and the clatter of keyboards. By night, it was a cavernous void, eerily silent except for the faint buzz of fluorescent lights and the occasional hiss of the old heating system. My routine was simple. I clocked in at 9 p.m., made my rounds to ensure the building was secure, and spent the rest of the night monitoring the CCTV screens in the security office. It was a solitary gig, but I didn't mind. In fact, I enjoyed the stillness, no crowds, no distractions, just me and the building. I usually brought a thermos of coffee, a couple of sandwiches, and a dog-eared paperback to pass the time. Most nights, my shift felt like a blur of sameness. I'd patrol each floor, checking that doors were locked, lights were off, and nothing was out of place. The building had 5 floors, including a basement that housed a labyrinth of storage rooms and mechanical equipment. I'll admit, the basement always gave me a weird vibe, not enough to scare me, but enough to make me eager to finish my checks there as quickly as possible. On this particular night, everything started out normal. It was early November, and the cold had crept into the city. I remember pulling my jacket tighter as I stepped out of my car and made my way to the security office. The air smelled of wet pavement, and the faint glow of streetlights reflected off puddles in the parking lot. The building stood dark and imposing against the night sky, its windows like black mirrors. I nodded to the day guard, Pete, as he handed over the keys and gave me the usual rundown. Nothing unusual during his shift, a couple of lights flickering on the 3rd floor, and a repair scheduled for the elevators later in the week. I settled into the office, poured myself a cup of coffee, and scanned the monitors. Everything looked as it should: empty hallways, locked doors, and rows of unoccupied desks. As the hours ticked by, I fell into the rhythm of my shift. I started my first round just after 10 p.m., walking the same path I'd walked 100 times before. The first floor was uneventful, just the hum of vending machines and the faint smell of cleaning supplies lingering in the air. On the 2nd floor, I noticed a stack of papers left on a desk near one of the windows. It wasn't unusual for someone to forget to tidy up before leaving, so I made a mental note to move it to lost and found later. By the time I reached the 3rd floor, I was already thinking about the sandwiches waiting for me back in the office. The flickering lights Pete mentioned were indeed doing their thing, casting strange shadows across the walls. I paused for a moment, staring at the way the shadows shifted, but quickly shook it off. Just old wiring, I muttered to myself, pressing on. When I got to the basement, the air seemed colder than usual, but I chalked it up to the old heating system. The faint hum of machinery filled the space, and the occasional drip of water from a pipe overhead broke the silence. I moved through the maze of storage rooms, shining my flashlight into each corner. There was nothing out of the ordinary, just stacks of old files, unused office chairs, and shelves lined with outdated equipment. I finished my rounds and headed back to the office, relieved to have the basement behind me. Sitting down at the desk, I took a bite of my sandwich and flipped open my book. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows and adding an extra layer of noise to the otherwise silent night. I glanced at the monitors again. Everything is still as before, or so I thought. By the time midnight rolled around, the building had settled into its usual silence. Outside, the wind continued to howl, occasionally pressing against the windows with a faint, ghostly whistle. I was halfway through my second round, flashlight in hand, my boots echoing faintly on the polished floors. It was as routine as it gets until I reached the basement again. The temperature seemed to drop noticeably as I descended the creaky staircase, my breath puffing faintly in front of me. I paused halfway down to rub my hands together, more out of habit than any real discomfort. The air down there always had a different quality, but this time it felt heavier, like walking into a room where an argument had just occurred. Shaking it off, I continued my descent. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I noticed something unusual. One of the storage room doors, the one closest to the boiler room, was slightly ajar. Now, I knew for a fact that I'd checked and locked it during my first round. The building's policy was clear. Every door had to be secured after hours. I frowned, nudged it open with my flashlight, and peeked inside. The room was as I'd left it, rows of metal shelves lined with boxes, the faint scent of dust and old paper hanging in the air. I swept the flashlight beam across the room, scanning for anything out of place. Nothing. The lock, still dangling from the latch, appeared intact, which made its position even stranger. Perhaps it hadn't caught properly when I locked it earlier? That seemed the most logical explanation. I pulled the door shut, locked it again, and tugged on the handle to double-check. Satisfied, I continued my round. As I moved through the basement, the unease lingered. It wasn't fear, exactly, but rather a nagging feeling that something was slightly off. I chalked it up to fatigue. It was late, after all, and I'd been working double shifts earlier that week to cover for Pete. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't entirely alone down there. By the time I finished my basement checks and returned to the main floors, I'd mostly pushed the incident from my mind. Back in the office, I poured myself another cup of coffee and settled into the chair, letting its familiar squeak ground me. The CCTV monitors were as unremarkable as ever. Empty halls, darkened offices, and nothing to suggest anything out of the ordinary. At least, that's what I thought at first. As I glanced at the monitor showing the basement corridor, a flicker caught my eye. It was so quick, I almost missed it, just the faintest blur in the corner of the frame. I leaned closer, staring at the screen, but nothing moved. The hallway was as still as ever, the only movement coming from the occasional static disturbance on the aging camera. I told myself it was a glitch, a common occurrence with the outdated equipment, and forced my attention back to my book. Still, I found myself glancing at the monitor every few minutes, waiting for what, exactly? I wasn't sure. Maybe I just wanted reassurance that the flicker had been nothing more than a technical hiccup. But reassurance wasn't what I got. About an hour later, during another cursory glance at the monitors, I noticed something peculiar. One of the basement storage room doors, the same one that had been ajar earlier, was now wide open. My stomach sank. There was no way it could have opened on its own. I had locked it, double-checked it, and ensured it was secure. My first instinct was to think someone had somehow entered the building. But how? All entrances were locked, and the alarm system would have alerted me to any breach. I grabbed my flashlight, clipped the security baton to my belt, and headed for the basement. My boots felt heavier than usual as I descended the stairs, the sound of my steps amplifying the quiet around me. The open door came into view as soon as I turned the corner. It swung gently, almost imperceptibly, as if moved by a draft. But the air was still. I approached cautiously, shining the flashlight inside. The room looked as it had before, boxes neatly stacked, shelves undisturbed. I stepped inside, scanning every corner, even crouching to peer beneath the lower shelves. Nothing. I couldn't decide if the absence of an intruder was comforting or unnerving. After a thorough check, I locked the door once more, my fingers gripping the latch tighter than necessary. Back in the corridor, I paused for a moment, listening. The hum of the boiler room was steady, unbroken, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed distantly. And then, just as I was about to turn away, I heard it. A whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind seeping through the old ducts. But as I strained to listen, it became unmistakable, a low, indistinct murmur, just audible enough to make out that it was human. I couldn't catch any specific words, but the tone sent a chill down my spine. It was like overhearing a conversation through a wall, muffled and disjointed. "Hello," I called, my voice steady despite the knot tightening in my chest. The whispering stopped abruptly. For a moment, the silence felt deafening, pressing in on me from all sides. I waited, my flashlight sweeping the hallway, but nothing moved. After what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to turn and climb the stairs. My pace quickened as I neared the top, a deep sense of relief washing over me as I returned to the security office. Sitting down, I took a shaky sip of coffee, my hands trembling slightly. I stared at the monitors, waiting to see the basement doors swing open again, or that strange flicker reappear. But the screens remained uneventful, the stillness of the building almost mocking. I debated calling Pete to ask if he'd ever experienced anything unusual during his shifts, but I stopped myself. What would I even say? That I heard a whisper in an empty building? That a locked door wouldn't stay closed? It all sounded ridiculous, even to me. I decided to keep it to myself, convincing myself that the whisper could have been an auditory trick, the heating system, the pipes, anything but what it had seemed. Still, as the hours stretched on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone in that building. The hours leading up to 3 a.m. are often called the dead hours, and that night, the term felt unnervingly appropriate. Sitting in the security office, I tried to focus on the pages of my book, but every little sound, every creak, every pop of the building settling seemed magnified. The air felt heavier now, carrying an inexplicable tension that pressed against my chest. The whisper I had heard earlier refused to leave my mind. I replayed it over and over, dissecting the sound, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it had been the wind in the vents, or a trick of acoustics. Yet, no matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise, it had sounded human. I forced myself back to the monitors, scanning each screen with heightened vigilance. The basement hallway remained still, the storage room doors securely shut. The other cameras offered the same monotony. Empty offices, deserted corridors, the occasional flicker of static. Nothing unusual. And yet, the feeling in the pit of my stomach refused to subside. It was during my third round of the night that the atmosphere shifted again. The building seemed quieter than before, the kind of silence that buzzes faintly in your ears. I started my usual route, my flashlight cutting through the darkened hallways. Everything appeared as it should, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as if I were being watched. I reached the third floor, the faint smell of dust and aged wood greeting me. The third floor was used mostly for storage, old office furniture, outdated equipment, and files that no one had bothered to digitize. The air was colder up there, and the beam of my flashlight picked up tiny particles floating lazily in the air. Halfway through the floor, I noticed something odd. One of the old office chairs had been moved. It now sat in the middle of the hallway, facing a blank wall. My steps faltered. I was certain the chair hadn't been there during my earlier rounds. I approached it cautiously, shining my flashlight on the floor for any signs of disturbance. The carpet was too worn to leave tracks, but the chair's position was undeniably deliberate. I placed a hand on its backrest, the cold metal sending a shiver up my arm. Turning it back toward the office it had come from, I muttered under my breath, probably just the cleaning crew messing around. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. The cleaning crew hadn't been in that part of the building in weeks, and they rarely worked after hours. I finished my rounds with my heart beating faster than I'd cared to admit, and by the time I returned to the office, I was rattled. The silence in the building felt oppressive now, almost alive. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the monitors, waiting for something to happen. It didn't take long. Around 3:30 a.m., as I watched the basement camera feed, the same flicker from earlier caught my eye. This time, it lingered longer. The blur of motion was at the far end of the corridor, near the boiler room. I squinted at the screen, willing it to focus, but the image remained distorted. The figure, if that's what it was, didn't move like a person. It seemed to shimmer, almost fade in and out of existence. Before I could process what I was seeing, the screen went black. Panic surged through me as I flipped through the feeds, but every monitor showed the same ominous void. I tapped the side of the console, muttering a string of curses. The cameras had failed before, but not all at once. Just as suddenly as they had gone dark, the feeds flickered back to life. I leaned forward, scanning the screens. The basement corridor was empty again, as if nothing had happened. My breath caught in my throat as I noticed something else. The storage room door, the same one I'd locked twice already, was open once more. This time, I didn't hesitate. Grabbing my flashlight and baton, I made my way to the basement. Each step down the staircase felt like a descent into something I couldn't quite explain. The air was colder than ever, and the faint hum of the boiler sounded off, like it was struggling against some unseen force. When I reached the bottom, I saw it immediately. The storage room door swung gently on its hinges, the motion slow and deliberate, as if inviting me in. My flashlight beam trembled slightly as I stepped closer. Inside, the room looked untouched, at least at first glance. But as I swept the flashlight across the shelves, something caught my eye. One of the boxes had been pulled out, its contents scattered across the floor. Papers, binders, and old office supplies lay in disarray, but one item stood out. In the middle of the mess was a photograph. Picking it up carefully, I held it under the beam of my flashlight. It was old, the edges yellowed and curling, showing a group of people in what appeared to be a company event. Their faces were clear enough, but there was something unsettling about their expressions. Their smiles didn't look natural. They were too wide, too strained, as if they were being forced to pose against their will. A faint sound broke the silence, making me freeze. It wasn't the whisper from earlier. It was a low, almost imperceptible hum, like someone humming a melody just out of earshot. My pulse quickened as I turned toward the door. "Hello," I called out, my voice cracking slightly. The hum stopped. I took a step back, my flashlight scanning the corridor outside. Nothing moved, but the oppressive feeling of being watched had returned tenfold. I locked the storage room door for the third time, yanking the handle with more force than necessary, and hurried back upstairs. Once in the safety of the office, I examined the photograph again. Turning it over, I noticed faint handwriting on the back. The ink was faded, but I could just make out the words, "We're still here." A chill ran through me, and I set the photo down as if it were burning my fingers. The phrase echoed in my mind, amplifying my unease. What did it mean? Who were we? The next hour was a blur of anxiety. Every small sound made me jump. My eyes darted between the photograph and the monitors, half expecting the strange figure to appear again. But the feeds remained static, the halls and rooms eerily still. It wasn't until 4:15 a.m. that the night took another turn. As I stared at the basement feed, I noticed something chilling. The chair from the third floor was now in the basement corridor, positioned directly in front of the boiler room door. I couldn't explain it. There was no way the chair could have moved on its own, and no one else was in the building. The sight of it sent a wave of dread crashing over me. My hands trembled as I picked up the radio, considering calling anyone for backup. But who would believe me? A chair moving on its own? Whispers in an empty building. I set the radio down, knowing I was on my own. Summoning what little courage I had left, I grabbed my flashlight and headed for the basement again. The sensation of being watched was stronger than ever, and as I descended, the hum returned. This time, it was louder, more distinct. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, the chair was exactly where I'd seen it on the monitor. It faced the boiler room door, as if daring me to open it. My flashlight beam wavered as I approached, the hum growing louder with each step. I reached for the door handle, my fingers brushing against the cold metal. Just as I started to turn it, the hum stopped. A heavy silence filled the air, and in that silence, I heard it again, the whisper. This time, it was louder, closer, and unmistakably real. The air in the basement felt dense, almost tangible, as if the weight of the entire building had settled into this one space. My grip on the flashlight tightened, its beam barely cutting through the oppressive darkness that seemed to radiate from the boiler room door. My heart raced, each beat reverberating in my ears like a drum signaling something I wasn't ready to face. The whispering had stopped, replaced by an unsettling silence. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the presence of something deeper, a void that seemed to swallow even the faint hum of the building's machinery. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, to leave the door untouched, but my curiosity, or perhaps my need for answers, overrode my fear. With trembling fingers, I gripped the cold metal handle and twisted it. The door creaked open slowly, revealing the boiler room bathed in dim, flickering light from a single overhead bulb. The shadows danced across the walls, twisting and contorting like living things. The first thing I noticed was the cold. The room was unnaturally frigid, the kind of chill that seeped into your bones and made you feel exposed. My breath came out in visible puffs, and the frostbitten air carried an unnatural stillness, as if time itself had paused. In the center of the room stood the chair. It was no longer the mundane piece of office furniture I had seen earlier. Now, it appeared weathered, ancient, its wood cracked and splintered as though it had aged centuries in a matter of hours. And then I saw it. Seated in the chair was a figure, its form barely distinguishable in the weak light. It was cloaked in shadow, and outlined more than a person, as if it had been drawn in the margins of reality. The figure's head was bowed, its face obscured by a curtain of dark, stringy hair. I froze, my instincts battling between flight and the need to know what I was looking at. "Who's there?" My voice came out shaky, barely more than a whisper. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised its head slowly, and my breath caught in my throat. Its face, or what passed for one, was a grotesque amalgamation of features. The skin was stretched taut, almost translucent, and its eyes were hollow voids that seemed to pull in the light around them. Its mouth stretched unnaturally wide in a twisted mockery of a grin, revealing rows of jagged teeth. But it wasn't the sight of the creature that unnerved me most, it was the sensation of being seen, truly seen, as though it were peering directly into my soul. The figure spoke, but not with a voice. The words reverberated in my mind, a cacophony of whispers layered atop one another. "You've come to see us." My legs felt like lead, rooting me to the spot. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. It was as if the figure held me in place with an invisible force, compelling me to confront it. The whispers in my head grew louder, more insistent. They weren't just speaking, they were prying, digging through my memories, my thoughts, my fears. Images flashed before my eyes. Moments I'd long buried, regrets I'd tried to forget. The sensation was invasive, like my very essence was being unraveled. "Why are you here?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely audible over the cacophony in my mind. The figure tilted its head, the grin never faltering. "We've always been here." The words sent a chill down my spine, their meaning as cryptic as the entity itself. I tried to step back, to create some distance between us, but my legs refused to obey. It was then that I noticed the room around me had changed. The walls seemed to ripple, their solid surfaces replaced by something darker, more organic. Shapes moved within the shadows, indistinct and fluid, as if the space was alive. The faint outlines of faces appeared and disappeared, their expressions contorted in silent screams. I wasn't in the basement anymore, not the basement I knew at least. The boiler room had transformed into a pocket of something else, a space that existed outside the bounds of normality. The figure in the chair rose slowly, its movements unnaturally fluid, as though gravity had no hold on it. As it stood, its full height became apparent, towering, elongated, and wrong in ways I couldn't put into words. My fight or flight instincts finally kicked in, and I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. The flashlight slipped from my grasp, clattering to the floor and plunging the room into near total darkness. The only light now came from the faint glow emanating from the figure itself, an eerie, pulsating aura that seemed to breathe. "Leave me alone," I shouted, my voice breaking under the weight of my terror. The figure took a step toward me, and with each movement, the whispers in my mind grew louder, more chaotic. It wasn't just speaking to me anymore, it was speaking through me. My lips moved involuntarily, echoing words I didn't understand, a language that felt ancient and forbidden. The oppressive sensation reached its peak, and I felt as though my very essence was being pulled apart. My vision blurred, and the room seemed to collapse around me, the walls folding in on themselves like a collapsing star. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The whispers ceased, the room stilled, and I found myself alone. The figure was gone, the chair empty, and returned to its original state. The boiler room looked as it always had, as if nothing had happened. I sank to the floor, my body trembling uncontrollably. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just experienced. Had it been real? A hallucination? The photograph from earlier came to mind, and I reached for my pocket, only to find it empty. The photo was gone. I staggered back to the security office, each step feeling heavier than the last. The monitors displayed the same uneventful feeds, the building as still and lifeless as ever. But I knew the truth. The figure's final words echoed in my mind, a haunting reminder that would stay with me forever. "We've always been here." Whatever had happened that night, it wasn't over. The building carried its secrets, and I was now a part of them. After what felt like hours, but was likely only minutes, I sat slumped in the security office chair, my body drenched in sweat, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The room felt alien now, despite its familiarity. Every creak of the old building seemed amplified, every shadow suspiciously out of place. My flashlight sat discarded on the desk in front of me, its battery flickering weakly. I glanced at the monitors, half expecting to see the figure again, or worse, to see myself frozen in time on one of the screens. But the feeds displayed nothing unusual, just empty hallways and locked doors. It was maddening, as if the building itself was gaslighting me, erasing every trace of what I had just endured. I knew I couldn't stay. The oppressive atmosphere, the lingering whispers in my mind, I had to leave. But walking out felt like surrendering to whatever force had claimed this place. Still, my survival instincts were screaming louder than my pride, so I grabbed my keys, shoved them into my pocket, and stood up. As I made my way to the exit, my steps were cautious, my ears straining for any sound that might signal the figure's return. The building was eerily quiet, save for the hum of fluorescent lights. I forced myself not to look over my shoulder, though every nerve in my body begged me to. Reaching the main entrance, I hesitated. The finality of leaving felt heavier than I expected. I turned back one last time, my eyes scanning the empty lobby. That's when I saw it. On the floor, directly in front of the security desk, was the photograph. The same sepia-toned image of the woman and her child that I had picked up hours ago, or what felt like hours ago. But now, something was different. The woman's face, once serene, was now twisted into an expression of terror. Her mouth was frozen mid-scream, her eyes wide and unseeing. The child was no longer standing beside her, but crouched in the corner of the frame, its small hands covering its face. A chill ran down my spine. My gut told me to leave the photo where it was, but something compelled me to pick it up. As I bent down and reached for it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound reached my ears. A single whisper. It wasn't words this time, just a breathy exhalation that sent my heart racing all over again. I straightened up, the photograph trembling in my hands, and shoved it into my pocket without another glance. I bolted for the door, my pulse hammering in my chest. The crisp night air hit me like a slap as I stepped outside, the door swinging shut behind me with a loud clang. I didn't stop until I reached my car, the parking lot illuminated by the dim orange glow of the overhead lamps. I sat in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel tightly, as though it could anchor me to reality. My mind was racing, trying to process everything that had happened. Had I lost my mind? Was it stress, exhaustion, or something far worse? Starting the car, I pulled out of the lot and drove without a destination. The city was quiet, the streets empty at this late hour. I didn't feel safe going home, not yet. Instead, I found myself parking at a 24-hour diner, the harsh fluorescent lights of the place offering a small sense of security. I ordered a coffee, though my hands were too unsteady to lift the cup. The waitress eyed me cautiously, likely noticing my disheveled state, but said nothing. I appreciated her silence. The photograph burned in my pocket like a weight I couldn't ignore. Against my better judgment, I pulled it out and set it on the table, staring at it under the fluorescent light. The faces were still altered, the woman's scream and the child's fear etched into the paper as if mocking me. I flipped the photo over, hoping to find some clue, anything to explain what I had experienced. On the back, written in faded ink, were two words: "Help us." A wave of nausea hit me. It wasn't just fear, it was guilt. Whatever presence haunted that building, it wasn't random. It had called to me, involved me, and now it wouldn't let go. I wanted to throw the photograph away, to leave it there on the table and walk out. But something told me it wouldn't matter. This thing, whatever it was tethered to me now. I sat there for hours, the untouched coffee growing cold in front of me, until the first rays of dawn began to filter through the diner windows. The oppressive weight that had followed me since leaving the building seemed to ease slightly with the sunlight, but it didn't vanish entirely. When I finally mustered the courage to head home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to stretch too far, every passing stranger's face too familiar. Aftermath. The following days passed in a haze. I quit my jobs at the security firm, claiming health reasons. My supervisor barely glanced at me as I handed in my badge and uniform, just another cog in the machine to replace. I didn't care. I couldn't go back there. The whispers followed me, though they were faint now, like echoes in the back of my mind. I tried to ignore them, to convince myself that it was all in my head. But the photograph remained as a constant reminder. I considered burning it, tearing it to shreds, anything to rid myself of its presence. But every time I tried, something stopped me, a feeling of dread, as though destroying it would unleash something far worse. So I locked it away, tucked it into a box, and shoved it into the back of a closet, hoping that out of sight would mean out of mind. But deep down, I knew better. The nightmares started soon after. Dreams of the boiler room, of the figure in the chair, of whispers that grew louder and more insistent with each passing night. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford, and I found myself wandering the streets at odd hours, searching for distractions that never came. I began researching the building, digging through old records and archives. What I found only deepened my unease. The property had a history, a long, dark history of unexplained disappearances, tragic accidents, and whispered stories of hauntings. But none of it offered me any answers. There was no explanation for what I had seen, no resolution to the question that haunted me most. Why me? Even now, as I sit here writing this, the photograph rests on the desk beside me. I don't know why I keep it, why I can't bring myself to destroy it. Perhaps it's a reminder, a tether to reality, or perhaps it's something more sinister, a piece of the puzzle that I'm too afraid to solve. All I know is that the whispers haven't stopped, and they never will. It's been 6 months since that night at the old office building. 6 months of restless sleep, fleeting moments of peace, and a growing realization that some questions might never have answers. Life has moved on in many ways. I've moved to a new apartment, started a less stressful job, and even tried to reconnect with old friends. But a part of me remains stuck in that moment, frozen in the dark corridors of a place I'll never set foot in again. The whispers haven't stopped entirely, though they're different now. Softer, more like faint murmurs at the edge of my awareness. Sometimes, late at night, when the world is still and I'm teetering between wakefulness and sleep, I think I hear my name. Not the hissing or threatening tone from that night, but something more desperate. Pleading. I've tried every rational explanation to understand what happened. Maybe I was overtired, my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe the stress of long nights in an eerie building pushed me to the brink. But no matter how many theories I come up with, none of them explain the photograph. None of them explain the figure or the way the building seemed to pulse with an energy that felt entirely real. The photograph sits in a drawer now, hidden beneath layers of papers and objects I rarely touch. I haven't looked at it since the day I locked it away, but I feel its presence, as though it's waiting for me to confront it again. I won't. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Some things are better left unanswered. I often wonder if the figure, the man in the chair, was ever truly malevolent. Yes, his presence was terrifying, his appearance a waking nightmare. But the photograph's message, "Help us," lingers in my mind. Was it a warning? A plea for help? Or something else entirely? The ambiguity gnaws at me, a puzzle with missing pieces that I'm too afraid to search for. There's a strange irony in how that experience has shaped my life. I used to be someone who thrived on routine, on the predictable. Now, I've embraced uncertainty, not because I want to, but because I've had to. When you encounter something that defies explanation, it changes you. You start to see the world differently. Shadows are no longer just shadows, and silence is never truly silent. I've started writing down my experiences, trying to make sense of them through the act of putting words on paper. It's therapeutic in a way, though it doesn't bring closure. Sometimes I think about sharing my story with others, warning them about that building, about the whispers that seem to linger long after you've left. But would anyone believe me? Or would they dismiss me as another overworked night guard with an overactive imagination? On rare occasions, I drive past the office building, keeping my distance, but unable to resist the pull of curiosity. It looks the same as it always did, unassuming, quiet, and utterly indifferent to the chaos it harbored within. I've seen new security guards standing by the front doors, smoking cigarettes or scrolling through their phones. I want to warn them, but what could I say? How could I explain what I don't fully understand myself? A few weeks ago, I found an article about the building. It mentioned plans to renovate, to turn it into a modern workspace. I wonder if that will change things, if the whispers and shadows will be exorcised by fresh paint and new tenants, or if they'll linger, adapting to their new environment like the ever-present energy they seem to be. Despite everything, I've learned to live with the fear. It's become a part of me, a constant companion that reminds me of how fragile reality can be. I no longer seek answers because I've come to realize that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. The world is vast and unknowable, and there's a strange comfort in accepting that. But there's one thing I can't ignore, one thought that keeps me awake on the darkest nights. What if it wasn't just a building? What if the whispers, the figure, the photograph, what if they've attached themselves to me? Sometimes, when I'm walking alone or sitting in my apartment, I catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. It's always gone when I turn to look, but the feeling stays. And then there are the dreams. They come less frequently now, but when they do, they're vivid and haunting. I'm back in the building, walking the same halls, hearing the same whispers. The man in the chair is always there, his head still bowed, his presence still oppressive. But in the dreams, I'm no longer running. I'm walking toward him, slowly, reluctantly, as though I finally gathered the courage or the foolishness to face him. I haven't reached him yet. I always wake up before I get too close. But I know that someday, in a dream or in waking life, I might have to confront whatever it is that haunts me. The thought terrifies me, but it also feels inevitable. Some connections, once formed, can't be broken. So, if you're watching this, take my story as both a warning and a reflection. The world is full of things we can't explain, forces that operate outside our understanding. Most of the time, we're lucky enough to avoid them. But if you ever find yourself in a place that feels wrong, a place where the shadows are too thick and the silence is too loud, leave. Trust your instincts. And if you find a photograph, one that feels out of place, with faces that change when you're not looking, don't pick it up. Don't take it with you. Some objects carry more than memories. Some carry pieces of the unknown, fragments of things that should never have been disturbed. As for me, I'll keep living my life as best as I can, carrying the weight of that night and the questions it left behind. And maybe, one day, I'll gather the courage to look at the photograph again, to confront the whispers, the shadows, and the man in the chair. The office wasn't anything fancy. A long hallway connected a series of cubicles, each lined with motivational posters and personal knickknacks to make it feel less soul-crushing. My desk sat near the back, facing a window that overlooked a dull parking lot. Every morning, I arrived with my coffee in hand, shuffled papers, answered emails, and exchanged polite nods with my coworkers. Speaking of coworkers, there was a small team of us, about 15 in total. Most were quiet, friendly people who clocked in, did their work, and clocked out without much fuss. There was Carla, the HR lady who always wore mismatched earrings, Tim, the IT guy with a knack for fixing things before you even finished explaining the problem, and Lisa, my manager, who had a habit of tapping her pen whenever she was stressed. The office had a rhythm. Mondays were quiet with everyone still shaking off the weekend. Wednesdays meant donuts in the break room, and Fridays brought the smell of microwave popcorn wafting down the hall. It was a predictable, almost comforting routine. One thing about the building always stood out to me, though, even from my first day there. It felt odd. Not in a way I could put my finger on, just an occasional sense of wrongness. The air seemed heavier in certain parts of the office, and the lights sometimes flickered for no reason. I chalked it up to an aging building and faulty wiring. My job wasn't glamorous, but it was stable. I handled inventory and procurement, which meant I spent a lot of time in the storage room. It was tucked away at the very end of the hallway, past the kitchenette and the supply closet. The room itself was small, with metal shelves lined with office supplies, printer paper, toner cartridges, and the occasional forgotten birthday banner. I liked it back there. It was quiet, and no one bothered me. One thing about the storage room always struck me as peculiar. The walls didn't line up perfectly with the dimensions of the building, according to the blueprints I'd seen when we expanded the office space last year. I'd mentioned it to Tim once, joking that maybe the architects had been hung over when they drew up the plans. He laughed and said, "Buildings like this always have quirks. Don't think too hard about it, or you'll drive yourself nuts." But it wasn't just the layout. The storage room had this feeling. The temperature was always a bit cooler than the rest of the office, even on hot summer days. The air seemed still, almost stagnant. I tried not to linger in there longer than I needed to. Looking back, I think the strangeness had always been there. But it wasn't until that day, a cold, gray Tuesday in November, that I really started to notice. It began as any other morning. I grabbed my usual cup of coffee from the cafe downstairs and took the elevator up to the third floor. Carla was already at her desk, chatting on the phone, and Lisa gave me her usual wave as I passed by. Everything felt normal, routine. That sense of normalcy was about to shatter in ways I could never have predicted. The air was thick with the hum of fluorescent lights overhead as I sat at my desk, staring at the same spreadsheet I'd been working on for the last hour. The office was mostly quiet, with the sounds of typing and the occasional murmur of voices floating in from the neighboring cubicles. I was just about to stretch when I heard a faint sound, a soft thud, almost like a door closing somewhere far away. I glanced around, but nobody seemed to acknowledge the noise. The sound hadn't been loud enough to warrant attention, so I shrugged it off. But as I went back to my work, it came again. This time, a bit clearer, and it sounded closer. A soft scraping, like furniture being moved across the floor. Furrowing my brow, I got up from my desk and walked to the hallway. Nobody was in sight. The office was eerily empty for a Thursday morning, which wasn't entirely unusual, but still felt odd. I glanced toward the storage room at the end of the hall. The door was closed, but there was a faint shadow shifting through the small frosted window. The same shadow that hadn't been there a moment ago. I stood there for a moment, feeling a sudden chill run through me. I chalked it up to the temperature fluctuations in the building. After all, it wasn't uncommon for certain rooms to feel colder than others, especially with the air conditioning system in this old place. But something about the way the shadow moved, almost unnaturally, gave me pause. I shook off the feeling and headed toward the break room for a coffee, telling myself it was just my imagination. But as I turned the corner, I saw Tim, the IT guy, walking toward me, his brow furrowed. "Hey, you hear that?" he asked, his voice low. "Hear what?" I replied, a little confused. "The noise," he said. "It's coming from the basement. I swear I heard something scraping down there, like furniture shifting." A chill crept up my spine. "I thought I heard something like that too," I admitted. "But I thought it was just the building settling." Tim looked uneasy. "I don't know. It's not like anything I've heard before." We stood there for a moment, both of us staring down the hallway toward the storage room and the basement stairs. The weird thing was, the noise hadn't sounded like it was coming from the basement at all. It had been closer to the storage room, almost as if it was right next to us. "I'll go check it out," Tim said, breaking the silence. "It's probably nothing, but I'll make sure everything's okay." I nodded, but the feeling in my chest tightened. Tim was a solid guy, calm and collected, but there was something in his voice that made me uneasy. He disappeared down the hall toward the staircase, and I turned back to my desk, trying to focus on my work. But the noise stayed with me. Every few minutes, I would glance up, half expecting to see Tim returning or anything that might explain the weird scraping sounds. But the office remained quiet, almost too quiet. Then, a few minutes later, the sound came again, this time louder and more distinct. I froze, my pen hovering above the page. The noise was unmistakable. It was coming from the storage room, but it was different now. Instead of a simple scrape, it was a dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. I didn't wait to investigate. I stood up quickly and walked to the hallway, my heart racing. I glanced toward the break room, but it was empty now. Tim hadn't come back. I swallowed hard, the uneasy feeling in my stomach growing. When I reached the storage room, I saw it. The door was slightly ajar. I hadn't remembered leaving it open. In fact, I was sure it had been shut when I'd walked past earlier. My pulse quickened, and I hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open further. Inside, the room looked normal. Everything was in its place, boxes stacked neatly, shelves lined with office supplies, nothing out of the ordinary. But there was something about the air. It felt wrong, heavy, like something had changed. I turned my head slowly, scanning the room, when my eyes landed on a strange sight. In the far corner of the room, there was a large metal cabinet pushed up against the wall. But it wasn't the cabinet itself that caught my attention. It was the way it was positioned. It seemed to have been moved recently. The floor beneath it was scratched, as though someone had dragged the cabinet across the concrete floor. My breath caught in my throat. I knew for a fact that cabinet had been stationary the day before. I had walked past it just the night before, and it hadn't been moved an inch. I stepped forward cautiously, my footsteps echoing in the otherwise silent room. As I approached the cabinet, I could hear the faintest sound, an almost imperceptible creak, like wood stretching. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The cabinet was wedged tightly against the wall, but I felt compelled to move it. I had to know what was behind it. I gripped the edge of the metal and tugged, the cabinet dragging along the floor with an unsettling screech. As it moved, a small gap appeared between the cabinet and the wall, just enough for me to glimpse something hidden behind it, a dark, narrow gap in the wall. It wasn't visible before. I felt my pulse race as I stepped closer, leaning in to get a better look. A door. The outline of a door was visible behind the cabinet. The wood was aged, the handle tarnished with years of neglect. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. There was no door here before, at least, not one that was listed on the blueprints. I reached out instinctively, my fingers brushing the brass handle. It was cold, and when I touched it, I felt a shock of static electricity, like the door had been waiting for me. I tugged at the handle, but it didn't budge. Locked. I felt a rush of both disappointment and relief wash over me. Disappointment because I couldn't open the door to find out what was behind it, but relief because the thought of what might be on the other side unsettled me more than I cared to admit. As I stood there, my mind racing with questions, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching from behind. I spun around, heart in my throat, to see Tim standing in the doorway, his face pale. "You feel that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Before I could answer, a low, guttural groan echoed through the walls of the building. It wasn't the wind or the building settling. It was something else. Something alive. Tim and I exchanged a look, both of us frozen in place. The strange sensation in the air grew stronger, like something was watching us, waiting. We both turned back toward the door, its outline still faintly visible behind the cabinet. Neither of us spoke, but we both knew one thing. There was something in this building, something we had no understanding of, and it was starting to make itself known. The days after the strange door appeared behind the storage cabinet were tense, the air thick with an unsettling energy that lingered, making the office feel more like a trap than a place of work. I kept thinking about that door, the one that shouldn't have existed according to any of the building's blueprints, the one I couldn't open. It haunted me, a constant reminder that something was wrong here, something that I couldn't understand. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead became a dull drone in my ears, something that used to fade into the background, but now felt more intrusive, louder than before. Every time the wind howled outside, rattling the windows, I flinched. It wasn't the wind that made the air feel so heavy, though. It was something else, something that had begun to make itself known. I spent my days sitting at my desk, trying to push the thoughts from my mind. But they lingered, and the quiet was never truly quiet. Every little noise sent my senses into overdrive. A paper rustling, a door creaking, the faint shuffle of feet just outside my office, though when I checked, nobody was there. It was like the building itself was conspiring to make me feel uneasy, to make me question everything I knew. Tim was no better. He was always looking over his shoulder, glancing nervously at the hallways, as though expecting something or someone to appear. The unease had spread between us like a disease, and neither of us knew how to stop it. The most disturbing part, though, was that neither of us ever spoke about the door again. We didn't have to. It was there, it was real, and it was something we were both trying to ignore. But the silence made it worse. One late afternoon, the office was even quieter than usual. I had stayed late to finish some work, and Tim had left a while ago, saying he had to check something in the server room. I knew he wouldn't be back for hours. The whole building was empty, except for me. I was alone with my thoughts, and that was when I heard it again. The faint scraping. It was distant at first, almost like it had come from the lower floors. But it grew louder, closer. The sound was unmistakable now, a heavy dragging noise. And it wasn't coming from the basement. It was coming from the hallway near the storage room. I froze, my pen dropping from my hand as my heart pounded in my chest. I wasn't sure if it was the wind. Maybe it was the building settling again, though I doubted it. The noise had a distinct quality, like something or someone was moving, pulling something heavy down the hall. I stood up slowly, my legs shaky, and walked toward the source of the sound. The hallway was eerily dark, the only light coming from the dim fixtures above. My breath was shallow as I approached the storage room. The noise stopped the moment I reached the door, and for a second, there was nothing but the pounding of my heart in my ears. I opened the door cautiously. The room was as I had left it, empty, the shelves lined with supplies, the cabinet wedged tightly against the wall. But something was different this time. The air felt colder, more oppressive, as though it were pressing in from all sides. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I glanced down at the floor, and I saw something that made my stomach twist. There were fresh, deep gouges in the concrete, marks that weren't there before. Something heavy had been dragged across the floor, and it was clear that it came from the space behind the cabinet. I felt a wave of nausea flood over me. My hands trembled as I stepped forward, reaching out to move the cabinet again. But as soon as I touched it, a strange, almost static-like sensation ran through my fingers. I pulled back quickly, my breath hitching in my throat. The cold had intensified, making the room feel unnaturally frigid. I stood there, torn between my instinct to run and the nagging pull of curiosity that kept me rooted to the spot. The noise, the scraping had stopped, but the unease had only deepened. Something was happening here, something I couldn't explain, something that didn't belong. The door was still there, the one behind the cabinet. I couldn't see it clearly, but I knew it was there. There was no mistaking it. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. I had to tell Tim, but as I turned to leave the room, I heard it again. The scraping. This time, it was louder than before, closer, almost as if it were right behind me. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. Just the empty room. The cold, still air. I had to leave. But before I could turn to go, the sound stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, almost imperceptible hum. It was as if the building itself were alive, breathing in and out with me, synchronized with my panic. The hum was faint, but it was there. I could feel it in my chest, in my bones. I stumbled out of the storage room, heart racing. But the hallway wasn't any better. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The familiar, once safe space now felt foreign, threatening. I made my way to my desk, my hands shaking as I tried to focus on the screen in front of me, trying to ignore the feeling of something or someone watching me. The office had always been a place where I felt comfortable, but now it was suffocating. The quiet that had once been calming now felt like a trap. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn into something that I had no control over. A few hours later, when Tim came back to the office, I could see it in his eyes. The same fear, the same uncertainty. I heard it too, he said quietly, as if he were afraid someone would overhear. Hear what? I asked, though I already knew the answer. The scraping and the hum. He paused, looking around nervously. And the door. I tried to open it, but it's locked. And the thing is, it's not supposed to be there. There's no record of it. No plans for it. I nodded. I couldn't speak for fear my voice would betray how terrified I really was. We stood there, looking at the door behind the cabinet, the same door neither of us had opened. We didn't need to say anything else. We both knew that the building had become something else entirely. It had become a place of shadows, of whispers, of things that weren't supposed to be. And there was no escaping it now. The feeling of dread had been creeping through the office like an invisible fog, thickening with every passing hour. By the time Tim and I returned the next morning, the tension between us had become palpable. We avoided eye contact as we sat at our desks, though neither of us could focus on our work. The door behind the storage cabinet weighed on our minds like a heavy burden, and no matter how many times we tried to tell ourselves it was nothing, we knew deep down that it was far from that. It was around midday when the office grew unusually still. The usual sounds of typing, phone calls, and the hum of computers had vanished, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. The kind of silence that presses in on you, forcing you to listen to every small creak of the building, every shift of air. Tim had been quieter than usual. His nervous energy was growing, and I could see it in the way he fidgeted, tapping his pen against the desk, glancing around at the corners of the office. It was like he could feel something I couldn't, something that was just beyond his reach. But I didn't need to see it to know that something was wrong. I could feel it too. Then the power went out. It wasn't a flicker. It was an abrupt, complete blackout. The lights snapped off, and the office was plunged into a suffocating darkness. My screen went blank, and I could hear Tim's chair scraping against the floor as he stood up, no doubt just as startled as I was. "Not again," Tim muttered, his voice barely a whisper in the blackness. I fumbled for my phone, using its faint light to guide my way. The air felt colder now, the temperature dropping so suddenly that it seemed unnatural. Goosebumps rose on my skin, my breath visible in the icy air. My heart hammered in my chest as I moved cautiously toward the hallway, my footsteps echoing unnervingly in the silence. "What the hell is going on?" I muttered under my breath. I knew the building had old wiring, but this wasn't like any power outage I'd experienced before. There was something deeply unsettling about it, something that felt deliberate, as though the darkness had been summoned for a purpose. And then I heard it, a low, rumbling hum that seemed to vibrate in the air itself. The same hum I'd heard the night before in the storage room. But this time, it was louder, more insistent. "Tim?" I called out. My voice sounded unnaturally loud in the silence. There was no response. I moved toward the storage room, my hand trembling as I reached for the door handle. I could feel the hum growing stronger, as though it was coming from behind that door, calling to me. Without thinking, I opened it. The cold air rushed out like it had been trapped inside, and for a moment, I felt like I was suffocating. The door was wide open. It shouldn't have been. Neither Tim nor I had dared to touch it since the first night. But now, the door stood ajar, inviting me to step through it. A soft, eerie light flickered in the space beyond, casting long shadows that twisted unnaturally. I couldn't see what was beyond the threshold, but I could feel something pulling me in, urging me to step forward. I turned to call out to Tim again, but the words died in my throat. He was standing behind me. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. "Don't," he whispered, his voice trembling. "We shouldn't go in there. Something's wrong. Something's already inside." I shook my head, my mind spinning. "But, no," he interrupted, his voice sharp. "You don't understand. I've been hearing things. At night. Whispering. The building. It's not just old. It's alive. It's been here before us." I felt a chill that wasn't just the temperature. Something in Tim's voice sent a cold shiver down my spine, and for the first time, I realized that he wasn't just afraid. He was terrified. Not of what was in the room, but of what the room was, and what it had been doing to him. To both of us. I stepped back, my hand gripping the doorframe. I didn't know what to do. The room felt like a living thing, pulsing with an energy I couldn't comprehend. But I had to know. Something in me was driving me forward, urging me to step into that light, to confront whatever was hidden in the dark space beyond. "Tim, we have to see what's in there," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We can't let this go on." Tim hesitated, his gaze fixed on the door, his body frozen with indecision. For a moment, I thought he might pull me back, drag me away from it. But then he took a slow step forward, and with that single movement, the tension broke. We entered the room together. The light inside was dim, flickering in a way that made it feel unreal, like it was coming from some otherworldly source. It wasn't the soft, warm glow of a lamp or a bulb. It was cold, sterile, like the light of a dying star, harsh and unfamiliar. And then I saw it. Behind the cabinet, hidden just out of view, was a wall. A thin, translucent membrane of sorts, shimmering faintly as if it were trying to hold itself together. I reached out instinctively, and as my fingers brushed against it, the wall rippled like water, sending a shock of cold through my body. It wasn't solid. It wasn't real. Tim gasped beside me. "This is it," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "This is what's been feeding off us. The building, the door. It's all part of it. This is what's been calling us." I recoiled from the wall, my mind reeling as the truth hit me with full force. The building wasn't just old. It wasn't just haunted. It had been built over something. Something ancient. Something that had lain dormant, waiting for the right moment to wake up. And now it was awake. As if in response to our presence, the wall pulsed once, then split down the middle, revealing a hidden room beyond. It was dark at first, but then the light inside flickered to life, revealing nothing. It was empty, except for the air. The air felt thick, heavy, as though it had been sealed off for years, maybe even centuries. And then I heard it. The whispering. It was soft at first, like the rustling of wind through dry leaves. But it grew louder, sharper. Voices, distant but unmistakable. As if hundreds of people were speaking at once, calling out in desperation. My pulse quickened, and I turned to look at Tim, who was staring at the room, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. He was frozen, as if caught in the grip of something far beyond his control. And then I realized something else. He wasn't breathing. His eyes were fixed on something in the room, and his body was stiff, rigid with fear. But it wasn't just fear, it was something more primal. Something that gripped him from the inside out. The voices were getting louder. The sudden slam of the door behind us felt like a final verdict. An irreversible decision had been made. We were trapped. Tim, still staring at the empty room, began to back away slowly, his steps tentative, as if he were testing the ground beneath him to make sure it wouldn't collapse. His face was pale, his eyes wide, and his breath shallow. I could see the panic rising in his chest, his whole body trembling as if he were struggling to maintain control. "Tim," I said, my voice barely audible in the tense air. "Tim, we need to get out. Now." He didn't respond, his gaze still fixed on the room beyond the translucent membrane. It was as if he couldn't tear his eyes away from it, as if something in there was drawing him in. I knew the feeling. The same compulsion was gnawing at me, urging me to take another step closer, to reach into the dark space beyond the door. But I wasn't going to do it. Not after everything that had happened. Not after the voices had started. I grabbed Tim by the shoulder, shaking him. "We have to go. Now." Finally, his eyes shifted to mine, and in them I saw a flicker of recognition. He understood. But the fear in his expression was overwhelming. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out, only a raspy, breathless sound. It was as if his throat had tightened, constricting around his voice. The whispers were louder now, the voices blending together, becoming more insistent. I couldn't understand them, but they were undeniable, like a chorus of frantic souls, pleading with us to listen, to understand. "Get out," Tim gasped, suddenly breaking free from my grip. "We can't stay here. We need to leave. This place, it's not just haunted. It's feeding off us." I couldn't argue with that. The oppressive presence in the room, the strange cold air, the way the building seemed to grow heavier. The longer we stayed, it was all part of something far bigger than I could comprehend. It had a life of its own, and it was drawing us in, using our fear, our confusion, to keep us locked in place. I reached for the door handle, my fingers shaking as I turned it. But the door wouldn't budge. It was like it was welded shut, frozen in place by some unseen force. I pulled harder, my muscles straining, but it wouldn't open. Panic set in. My heart hammered in my chest, and my breath came in sharp, ragged gasps. I turned back to Tim, who was now standing frozen, his eyes wide with fear. The whispers were growing louder, filling the room with a constant, pulsating rhythm. It was as if the building itself was alive, feeding off our terror. "Tim, help me," I pleaded, but my voice sounded distant, swallowed by the overwhelming noise of the whispers. Tim didn't move. His body was rigid, his gaze unfocused, lost in the same trance-like state that had overtaken him when we first entered the room. I could see the struggle in his face, the internal battle between wanting to escape and the pull of whatever was inside that room. And then, in a burst of desperate energy, I pulled the door with all my strength. There was a loud, sickening creak, like old wood under pressure, and then it finally gave way. The door swung open with a groan, revealing the hallway beyond. I didn't wait for Tim. I didn't look back. I ran. The hallway was dark, the power still out, but I didn't care. My feet pounded against the floor as I made my way to the elevator. The air was thick, like walking through a dream, but I couldn't slow down. I needed to get out, to escape whatever had taken root in that building. As I reached the elevator, I slammed the button repeatedly, my hands slick with sweat. The doors didn't open right away, but I kept pressing, desperation mounting with each passing second. I turned to look back down the hallway, expecting to see Tim following, but he was nowhere to be found. The elevator doors finally opened, and I stepped inside, my hands shaking as I pressed the button for the ground floor. The ride felt impossibly slow, each floor passing with agonizing slowness. I couldn't breathe, couldn't focus on anything except the nagging feeling that something was behind me, closing in on me, waiting for me to make a mistake. The doors finally opened to the lobby. I didn't look around. I just bolted for the front door, throwing it open and running out into the fresh air. The cool breeze hit my face like a shock, and for the first time in what felt like days, I could breathe again. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking so badly that it took me a few tries to get the door open. Once I was inside, I locked the doors and started the engine without hesitation. I didn't know where I was going. All I knew was that I needed to get away. Get far, far away from that building. As I sped through the streets, I couldn't shake the image of Tim's face. His blank stare, the way he had been consumed by whatever had taken hold of that place. And the whispers that had stayed with me, echoing in my mind, even though I was no longer in the building. It wasn't over. The days that followed were a blur of confusion, a disorienting mix of emotions. Relief, fear, disbelief, all rolled into one. I had driven away from that building, away from the nightmare that had taken hold of me, but something lingered. It wasn't just the memories. It was the feeling something cold, something wrong, following me even as I tried to put miles between myself and the place. It was a feeling that I couldn't shake, no matter how many times I told myself that it was over, that I had escaped. But the nightmares came. Every night, without fail, the same scene replayed in my mind. I would be standing in that hallway, facing that door, and the whispers would start. They weren't just whispers anymore, they were voices, distinct and clear, calling to me, begging me to return, pleading for me to come back and understand. And in those dreams, I would always reach for the handle, my hand moving against my will, my body paralyzed by the compulsion to open that door again, to step into the darkness. I tried to ignore them at first, telling myself it was just my mind trying to make sense of what had happened. But it wasn't just the dreams. It was the way I felt in my own home. The way the shadows seemed to linger a little too long at the edges of my vision. The way the air felt just a little too cold, no matter how high I turned up the heat. It wasn't right. It wasn't normal. I thought I had outrun it. I thought I had left it all behind. But the truth was, it had followed me. I couldn't escape it. I tried to go back to the office building, thinking that perhaps seeing it in the daylight, in the presence of others, would calm my mind. Maybe the horror would just fade, like a bad dream after a good night's sleep. I wasn't sure what I was hoping for, but I knew I had to confront it, or else I would never find peace. But when I arrived, I realized something was wrong. The building was locked up tight. The parking lot was empty. The lights were off, the windows dark. It was as if the place had been abandoned. There was no sign of life, no sign of anything at all. I stood there in the parking lot, staring up at the building, my stomach churning with the same dread that had followed me since the moment I first stepped foot in that cursed room. I waited, hoping for something to break the silence, but nothing came. No doors opened. No one appeared. It was as if the entire building had never existed at all. I turned to leave, but as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that I hadn't truly left, that whatever had taken root in that building was still with me, waiting for me to make the next move. The reality hit me then, like a cold hand on the back of my neck. I hadn't escaped. I would never escape. I thought back to the first time I entered the building, to the strange sense of unease I had felt even before we discovered the hidden room. The way the air had felt wrong, the way the building seemed to press in on me as if it had its own agenda. I thought about the door, the way it seemed to open of its own accord when I wasn't looking, and the darkness that swallowed everything in its path. It wasn't just the room, it was the entire building. The entire place had been a trap, and we had walked right into it. And the worst part was that I had known it all along. I had known something was wrong from the moment we stepped inside, but I had ignored it. I had pushed it aside, telling myself it was all in my head. But now I knew the truth. The building wasn't haunted. It was something worse. It was alive. I don't know what it wants or why it chose us, but I know that I will never be free of it. It's part of me now, embedded in my thoughts, in my dreams, in the very air I breathe. And no matter where I go, I know that it's waiting. I don't know if Tim ever made it out. I haven't heard from him since that day. But part of me believes that he too is still trapped, still lost in that room. Or worse, that he has become part of whatever it is that haunts that place. I try to keep my mind occupied, to live a normal life, but every so often I feel that pull, the tug of something dark, something malevolent, reaching for me. And I know it won't stop. It will never stop. It's only a matter of time before it comes back for me. It's only a matter of time before I return. It was the fall of 2012 when I decided to take a weekend camping trip, just to get away from the constant noise of city life. I had been working nonstop for months, and I figured a few days in the wilderness would help me recharge. My plan was simple: head into the forest, pitch a tent by a stream, and enjoy some quiet time with just nature for company. The weather was typical for the season, cool but not too cold, with the scent of fallen leaves and earth filling the air. I had packed all the usual gear: tent, sleeping bag, flashlight, and enough food to last me a few days. It wasn't supposed to be a challenging trip, just a peaceful retreat. The woods I was heading into were part of a larger national forest, and I'd been there before without incident. It wasn't an area known for being particularly dangerous, but you never know what you'll encounter when you're out there on your own. I set off from my car with a light pack, enjoying the quiet of the trail, the crunch of leaves underfoot, and the occasional bird call in the distance. The trail I was following was well marked, a route I had taken in the past. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary as I ventured further into the woods, deeper than I usually went. The first day was relaxing. I set up camp by a small stream, gathered some firewood, and spent a few hours reading. There was nothing too remarkable about that day, just the kind of quiet solitude I had been craving. I even made a simple dinner over the fire. The air grew cooler as the sun dipped below the horizon, and I retired to my tent early. The following morning, I decided to explore a bit further. The weather was crisp, and the sun was just starting to rise, casting long shadows across the trail. As I ventured further into the woods, the familiar trail began to disappear. The path was becoming less distinct, and soon I was moving off the beaten track. It wasn't my intention to get lost, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured I could always retrace my steps if necessary. The deeper I went, the quieter it seemed. I hadn't seen anyone else since I left the main trail, and that was fine with me. I was used to being alone in the wilderness. But something was different this time, something in the air, a sense of something off. I couldn't place it, but I pushed it aside. By late afternoon, I realized I had wandered farther than I had planned. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees, and I knew I needed to head back soon. But the trail I thought I had been following was gone, and the landscape around me felt unfamiliar. The trees were taller, more densely packed. There was a chill in the air that I hadn't noticed before. At that point, I realized I was lost. The night stretched on, and I sat there in the corner of the cabin, the silence wrapping itself around me like a thick blanket. I had been hoping that the rest would help me gather my bearings, but instead, I found myself growing more anxious with every passing minute. The strange unease I had felt earlier was now something more tangible, creeping up on me from the shadows, settling deep in my chest. It wasn't just the isolation, it was the cabin itself. There was something about this place that felt wrong, as though it didn't belong here, in the heart of the forest, far from any human civilization. I glanced around again, the dim beam of my flashlight casting long shadows across the room. Nothing moved, but the air seemed to grow heavier, thicker, as though the walls themselves were pressing in on me. I tried to shake off the feeling. After all, it was just a cabin. Old, abandoned, but just a cabin. I needed to stay calm. I had to stay calm. But then something happened. At first, it was small, almost too subtle to notice, like a fleeting thought or a whisper in the back of your mind. The chair, the old wooden chair in the corner, creaked. Not a normal creak, but a slow, deliberate sound, like it was being shifted, pushed. My eyes snapped to it, my heart skipping a beat. The chair had been still, unmoving, when I first walked in. Now, it seemed as though it had shifted ever so slightly, a few inches closer to the table. I blinked, trying to convince myself it was just the wind, or maybe the cabin settling under the weight of the night. After all, old houses do that, right? They groan and creak in the silence of the dark. But even as I tried to rationalize it, my gut told me something was off. I stood up, cautiously, my breath shallow as I approached the chair. I hesitated, looking at it, then around the room again. Nothing. No one. I took a deep breath and reached out to steady the chair, moving it back to its original spot. The wood groaned under my touch, and for a moment, I felt like I was being watched, like there was someone just behind me, standing in the dark, waiting for me to make a mistake. But when I turned around, there was nothing there. The room was still empty, still silent. I let out a shaky breath and tried to calm myself. Maybe it was just the stress of being lost, the isolation playing tricks on me. I couldn't let my mind run away with me. I needed rest. I settled back down in the corner, trying to focus on anything but the growing dread gnawing at my insides. The air in the cabin felt stifling now, almost too thick to breathe. It wasn't hot, but the oppressive feeling of being trapped inside something that wasn't quite right weighed on me. I closed my eyes, telling myself I'd be fine. I'd sleep for a few hours and figure things out in the morning. But sleep didn't come easily. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I wasn't truly alone. The air seemed to move around me, a faint draft that I couldn't trace, and every so often I thought I could hear something soft, like a distant sigh or the faint rustling of leaves, though I knew the windows were boarded up, and the wind hadn't been that strong. It wasn't until I heard the second sound that I knew something wasn't right. This time, it wasn't a creak or a groan of wood. It was a scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. I froze, my heart racing. I hadn't moved since I sat back down. The sound grew louder, closer, until it stopped right behind me, just inches away. My breath caught in my throat, and I dared not move, afraid that even the smallest motion would reveal my position. I turned slowly, trying to keep my breathing steady. The beam of my flashlight swept across the room, lighting up the corners. Nothing. The scraping sound had stopped as suddenly as it had started. My pulse was hammering in my ears, and I could feel the blood rushing to my face as my thoughts raced. What was it? What had made that sound? I stood up again, my legs shaking, and walked across the room. I didn't want to look under the chair or behind the table. I didn't want to find something that would make everything worse. But I had to know. I had to be sure. The floor was empty. There was nothing there, no sign of anything that might have made the noise. Still, the sense of something lingering, something unseen, wouldn't go away. It was as if the cabin itself was watching me, waiting for me to slip up. I glanced at the door, wondering if I should just leave, get out of there. But the thought of venturing back into the woods at night was just as terrifying. I didn't know where I was, how to get back to the trail. I was trapped, stuck in this cabin with whoever was causing these strange happenings. I tried to steady my nerves, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the stress of being lost and alone in the woods. But as I walked back to the corner, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that the atmosphere in the cabin was different, thicker somehow. It felt colder now, and the shadows seemed deeper, as though they had expanded to fill the room. I couldn't stand it anymore. I needed to get some sleep, to reset my mind and try to make sense of everything. I lay down on the hard floor, pulling the sleeping bag around me tightly, trying to block out the strange noises. I closed my eyes, praying for a few hours of peace, but just as I began to drift off, I heard it again. The scraping sound. This time, it was closer. It was unmistakable, the sound of something heavy dragging across the wooden floorboards. My eyes snapped open, and my heart seemed to stop. I listened, straining to hear, but all I could hear was my own breathing, quick and shallow. I sat up, clutching the sleeping bag to my chest. The room was silent again. Was I hearing things? Was I going mad? I glanced at the corner where the chair had been. It had moved again. The room felt suffocating, and every inch of it seemed to stretch and pull at my nerves like a living thing. I couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something or someone was in this cabin with me. But what? And why? These questions twisted inside my mind like a knot that couldn't be undone. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, wondering how much longer I could stay in this eerie isolation before my mind broke under the weight of it all. I had convinced myself that I couldn't keep pretending nothing was happening. The noises, the inexplicable movements, these things weren't just figments of my imagination. There was something out there, something in the shadows, and I couldn't keep running from it. My heartbeat pounded in my chest, each thud a reminder that I wasn't alone. I knew I had to leave the cabin. But where would I go? The woods outside were vast, endless. I had no idea how to find my way back to the trail. I had no choice but to confront whatever was happening here, even if it meant facing things I wasn't ready to understand. When I stood up, the floorboards creaked beneath me, their groans sounding louder in the silence of the cabin. I couldn't tell if it was the house settling or something more sinister. The scraping noise had come from behind me earlier, but now it was almost like the walls were breathing, a slow, rhythmic sigh from deep within the cabin's bones. I shivered. I walked cautiously to the corner of the room, my flashlight cutting through the darkness in thin, trembling beams. As I stepped closer to the chair that had moved earlier, I froze. There it was again, another noise. This time, it was a soft thud, followed by what sounded like something dragging itself across the floor. I whipped around, scanning the room with wild eyes. Nothing. There was nothing there. I took a deep breath and crouched down next to the chair. The air felt unnaturally cold around me, as though the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a deep, unsettling feeling settled in my gut. It was as if something was watching me, waiting for me to make my next move. The chair, once again, had shifted slightly. This time, though, the movement was far more noticeable. It had been moved a few feet closer to the table, but now the seat was facing directly toward the window. I stared at it, my pulse racing. There was no way it had moved on its own. I hadn't touched it. The air was still. I backed away slowly, my legs shaking as I stumbled toward the other side of the room. The sensation of being watched intensified, the sense that something was right behind me, just out of sight. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. With hesitant steps, I moved toward the back door. I knew the forest lay just beyond, but I couldn't stand another minute in this place. Something was wrong, and I needed to find out what. The door opened with a soft creak, revealing the dark, oppressive woods stretching out before me. It was pitch black, but the moonlight filtering through the trees gave just enough light for me to see the path ahead. I stepped outside, my breath caught in my throat. The forest felt different here, alive, somehow. It was like the trees were leaning in closer, watching me, judging me. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves in the distance, but there was no wind near the cabin, no breeze to carry away the stifling tension. I wasn't alone out here either. The woods had become part of the mystery, a twisted companion to the cabin that had been haunting me from the start. I tried to steady my nerves, telling myself that I would be fine. I just needed to walk, keep moving, keep my mind focused on anything but the crawling dread creeping through my bones. As I ventured deeper into the woods, I thought I heard something, footsteps, faint but deliberate. I whipped around, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was nothing behind me, only the dense thicket of trees that stretched as far as the eye could see. I paused, my breath catching in my throat as I scanned the forest. The sound came again, but this time it was unmistakable, the unmistakable sound of someone or something moving just beyond the reach of my vision. My pulse quickened, and I took a few cautious steps forward, then stopped, listening intently. There was no mistaking it now. Someone or something was definitely out there. With each step I took, the sound seemed to draw closer, the eerie rustling in the underbrush now accompanied by low, guttural whispers. I couldn't make out the words, but they sounded like they were coming from multiple voices, rising and falling like a chant or some kind of strange incantation. I froze, rooted to the spot. The whispers grew louder, clearer, like they were coming from all around me. Panic surged through me, my body screaming for me to turn and run. But I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, trapped in this invisible web of sound and shadow. Then, without warning, the whispers stopped. A strange silence settled over the forest, thick and suffocating. My breathing was ragged in my chest, each inhale sharp and shallow. I dared not move. My mind raced, trying to process what had just happened, what I had just heard. Was it real? Or had my isolation, my fear, finally gotten to me? Suddenly, there was a loud snap, like a twig breaking underfoot. My head jerked to the side, and my flashlight flickered out, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled with the flashlight, my hands trembling as I tried to turn it back on. The beam sputtered and flickered for a moment before it stabilized, and when it did, I saw something that made my heart nearly stop. There, standing just at the edge of the trees, was a figure. Tall, unnaturally still, watching me. I couldn't make out any details, only the shape of a person, or something that resembled a person. My blood ran cold as the figure remained motionless, just beyond the reach of my light. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its gaze locked onto mine, the air heavy with an unspoken understanding. Without thinking, I turned and bolted back toward the cabin, my footsteps echoing in the silent forest. I couldn't look back, not now, not with the shadows closing in on me. The whispers had started again, louder this time, the voices growing frantic and desperate. I reached the cabin and slammed the door behind me, my heart racing as I collapsed against it, gasping for air. My mind was in a whirlwind, my thoughts crashing into each other in a storm of fear and confusion. I had to get out of here. I had to leave this place. But then, just as the thought crossed my mind, I heard it again, the scrape, followed by the dragging sound. The chair had moved again. The silence in the cabin was deafening. My ears rang with the absence of sound, but the scrape and drag of the chair continued in the background, growing louder, more deliberate. My heart raced, thundering in my chest as I stood frozen at the door, my hands still pressed against the cold wood. I forced myself to turn away from the door, my legs shaking beneath me. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. There was something in this cabin, something waiting for me. Something I had to face. I didn't know how much time had passed since the chair had moved. It felt like hours, but it was only a few minutes long enough to send my mind spiraling out of control, long enough to let the dark thoughts fester. I could still hear the scraping noise, but it was no longer the chair. It was something else, something bigger. I couldn't breathe. The air in the cabin had changed. It was thicker, heavier, as though the very walls were closing in on me. The room seemed to grow smaller with each passing second, and the shadows in the corners twisted and shifted, elongating into monstrous shapes. I couldn't tear my eyes away. It was as though the cabin itself was alive, watching, waiting for me to make my next move. Without realizing it, I had moved toward the window. I pressed my palm against the glass, the chill of it seeping into my skin, and looked outside. The forest was dark, but the moonlight was sharp, casting long, eerie shadows across the trees. The whispers, the voices that had plagued my thoughts since I arrived, were louder now, like a chorus of muffled cries from the distance. My breath fogged up the glass as I leaned in closer, trying to make sense of what was out there. And then I saw it. Something moved in the trees. It was a shape, a figure, unlike anything human. It shifted from tree to tree, almost liquid in its movement, like it was gliding, impossibly fast. It didn't walk. It didn't run. It just moved. I pulled away from the window, gasping for air. My mind was spinning, but I couldn't let myself succumb to the panic. Not yet. I needed to understand what was happening. The woods outside had become a labyrinth of shadows, a place where the laws of reality no longer seemed to apply. I turned back toward the center of the room, my eyes locked onto the chair. It had moved again. No, it had been thrown. The chair now sat on its side in the middle of the room, the back facing me as if it were waiting for me to sit. I stepped forward cautiously, my breath shallow, and knelt beside it. The wood was splintered and cracked, the damage fresh, as though someone had thrown it with incredible force. A noise came from behind me, faint at first, but then it grew louder, a low, guttural growl, deep and rumbling. It vibrated through the floorboards and rattled the windows, making my skin crawl. I whipped around, expecting to see something standing in the doorway, but there was nothing. Just the empty space, the still air. I took a step backward, my mind struggling to keep up with what I was feeling. The growl wasn't just sound, it felt physical, as though it was coming from within the walls themselves. It was a warning, a signal that something powerful was approaching. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the cabin, in the darkest corner of the room, the shadows began to take shape. The air seemed to distort, the edges of the room blurring as though I were looking through a warped lens. A figure emerged from the darkness, tall, cloaked in tattered rags, its face hidden in shadow. But it wasn't human. It couldn't be. I felt my blood run cold, my legs trembling as I fought to stay upright. My body screamed at me to run, to escape, but my feet wouldn't move. I was rooted to the floor, my gaze fixed on the figure. It was as if it were pulling me in, drawing me closer with its presence. The growl grew louder, and the figure stepped into the faint light. Its limbs were unnaturally long, twisted at odd angles, and its hands were gnarled and sharp, like claws reaching toward me. It made no sound as it moved, but I could feel its presence in the room, its gaze boring into me, even though I couldn't see its face. The air was thick with an overwhelming sense of dread, the kind that paralyzes you, that wraps around your heart and squeezes the life out of you. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I was locked in place, my mind reeling with terror, unable to process what I was seeing. It reached toward me, its clawed hand stretching forward with terrifying speed. I flinched, expecting to feel the cold, sharp grasp of its fingers closing around my throat, but instead, the air seemed to shift. The ground beneath me trembled, and a sudden, violent gust of wind slammed into the cabin, rattling the windows and shaking the walls. The figure screeched a horrible, inhuman sound that cut through my mind like a blade. In that moment, I finally found my voice. I screamed. The figure recoiled, its body twisting unnaturally as it hissed and writhed as though in pain. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone, vanished into the shadows from which it had emerged. The cabin fell silent once more, the only sound my ragged breathing. I stumbled backward, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The air still crackled with an electric tension, the walls seeming to pulse with some unholy energy. I didn't know what it was that had just attacked me, but I knew one thing for certain: it wasn't over. Whatever had been lurking in the cabin, whatever force had been behind the whispers and the chair movements, was still here. I could feel it, waiting. The cabin was silent again, the oppressive darkness settling back over everything like a heavy blanket. My pulse hammered in my chest, every heartbeat feeling like it might be my last. I could still feel the weight of the thing's presence in the room, even though it was gone. It was like the air had thickened, like it had absorbed whatever malevolent force had occupied this place for so long. I didn't waste a second. The door was still ajar, and I was moving before my brain had even fully caught up with what had just happened. My legs, weak and trembling, carried me with a mind of their own. I had to get out. I had to leave this place behind before whatever that thing was came back, or worse, followed me. The air outside was sharp and cold, a stark contrast to the stifling warmth of the cabin. I didn't care where I was going, only that I needed to move away from the cabin, away from the woods, away from whatever that thing had been. The trees closed in around me, the shadows seeming to stretch and shift in ways that made my skin crawl. The wind whispered through the leaves, but it felt more like a warning now, like nature itself was conspiring to keep me trapped. I forced myself to keep walking, not daring to glance back, but the feeling of eyes on me wouldn't go away. Every rustle in the underbrush, every snap of a twig underfoot, had my heart leaping into my throat. I was being followed. I knew it, but the forest was eerily still. No sounds except for the wind and the crunch of leaves beneath my feet. It felt like I was the only one left in the world, like the forest had swallowed everyone else whole. I hadn't seen anyone since I entered the woods. No one was coming for me. I needed to get to the road. The road was where safety lay, where I could finally escape this nightmare. My eyes scanned the darkened trees, trying to find some sign of the trail, something familiar. I had been here before, but everything felt wrong now. The woods, once so peaceful, had become an endless maze of twisting paths and dark shadows. I stumbled on, my mind a blur of panic, replaying every moment that had led me here. The figure in the cabin, the whispers in the trees, the scraping of the chair, everything had been leading up to this moment. But why? What did it want from me? What was the thing in the cabin, and why had it been watching me? The cold night air bit at my skin, but it didn't help clear the fog in my mind. I had to keep moving. I had to get out. But the sound of footsteps behind me, soft, deliberate, made me freeze in my tracks. My breath caught in my throat. I turned slowly, my heart pounding as I strained to hear any other sounds. Nothing. The forest was dead silent again. I waited, but no one appeared. Still, the sense of being watched didn't go away. It was as if the entire forest had become a trap, and I was its prey. The trees stood tall and silent, but they felt like silent sentinels, their branches reaching toward me like skeletal fingers. I forced myself to continue, but the path seemed endless. Every step felt heavier, and the darkness seemed to press in from all sides. My eyes burned with the strain of trying to see in the inky blackness, but the shadows played tricks on me. A flash of movement in the corner of my eye would make me whip my head around, but there was nothing there. As I walked, I thought about the cabin, about the thing that had appeared, the thing that had tormented me. It was still out there, in the forest somewhere, waiting for me. I could feel its presence like a weight on my chest, pressing me down with every step I took. And then I heard it again, the soft, deliberate footsteps. This time, I didn't turn. I didn't want to see what was behind me. I wanted to run, to escape, but something in my gut told me that I was being led somewhere. The footsteps were guiding me, pulling me deeper into the woods. I tried to fight it, tried to turn back, but my feet would move. I was being drawn forward, like a puppet on a string. Suddenly, the trees opened up, and I found myself in a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a tall figure, cloaked in shadow. The air seemed to shimmer around it, like a heat wave rising from the ground. My heart stopped. It was the same figure from the cabin. It didn't move, but I could feel its presence, its cold, suffocating energy filling the space around me. The forest had fallen into a complete silence, as if everything had stopped, waiting for whatever was about to happen. I took a step back, but it was too late. The figure stepped forward, its limbs long and twisting, unnatural. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. It was as though the very air had thickened, smothering me. And then, in a voice that didn't belong to any human being, it spoke. "You should have never come here." The words sent a jolt of ice through my veins, and in that instant, I knew I wasn't going to make it out of this alive. Whatever it was, whatever force had been haunting this place, had claimed me. I had come too far into its domain, and now it wasn't going to let me leave. The figure moved closer, its fingers outstretched, and I felt a coldness like nothing I had ever experienced, like the very soul of the forest was being drained out of me. I tried to scream, to run, but the words caught in my throat, and my legs refused to cooperate. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was the figure's face. No, it wasn't a face. It was a mask of shifting shadows, endless and ever-changing. The last sound I heard was the rustling of the leaves, like whispers in the wind. And then there was nothing. I've tried, in the months since, to piece together what happened, but some things are beyond understanding, beyond explanation. The more I think about it, the more it becomes clear to me. The forest is not a place to be explored. It's not just a collection of trees and soil. It is something older, something deeper. Its presence is a constant pull, a lure to those who wander too far, to those who listen to its whispers in the wind. I don't know what happened to the others, those who disappeared before me. Their stories, their names, have all faded, lost to the very same darkness that sought to claim me. But I do know this. Once the forest has you, once you've crossed its threshold, you are no longer your own. You are merely another part of its eternal hunger, its ceaseless craving for souls to devour. But it's not just the forest that haunts me. It's what I saw in the cabin, what I felt in that moment of terror. The figure was something far older, far darker than I could ever comprehend. It wasn't a man. It wasn't a creature. It was something beyond my limited understanding of reality. A force, an entity, that existed outside the realms of our world, waiting for the right moment to strike. I still hear the whispers sometimes, when I close my eyes. The rustling of the leaves, the crackling of a fire in the distance. The sensation that I'm being watched, followed. The feeling that something is out there, just beyond the edge of my vision, waiting for the moment to come back for me. I've tried to push it out, to bury it under the routine of daily life, but it lingers. A shadow on my mind, a weight that I cannot shake. It's strange, how life can seem so normal one moment, and then so utterly broken the next. I've tried to explain the events of that night to people, try to put the words together in a way that makes sense. But no one understands. No one believes. They think I'm crazy, that I was lost in the woods and let my imagination get the better of me. But they weren't there. They didn't hear the footsteps, didn't feel the eyes on them, didn't see the figure that wasn't human, wasn't anything of this world. I can't go back to those woods. I can't even think about them without my chest tightening, without a wave of dread washing over me. The memories are too real, too vivid. The smell of damp earth, the rustling of leaves, the oppressive silence that filled the space like a living thing. The cabin, with its dark, musty air, the sense that it had been waiting for someone to cross its threshold. And the figure, the shadow, that never left me. It's like it's still there, in the back of my mind, lurking just out of reach, waiting for the moment when I let my guard down. But maybe that's the trick, isn't it? Maybe the forest doesn't let you go. Maybe, once it has you, you are bound to it forever, caught in its endless loop of terror. I wonder sometimes if I'll ever truly escape its pull. If there's a way to break free from the grip of whatever that thing was, from the dark influence that lingers in the woods. I have tried to move on, to live a normal life. But the shadow of what happened lingers. Sometimes, when I wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, heart racing, I think I hear the whispers again. The same whispers that led me into the woods in the first place. And for a moment, I wonder if I'm truly safe, or if the forest is still out there, waiting for me to return. The hardest part is knowing that I'll never have the answers. I'll never understand what I saw, what I felt, what I heard. The woods are a place of mystery, of darkness, of things that should never be disturbed. And once you've seen the things that I saw, you realize that some questions are better left unanswered. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. It was a warm summer evening, just the kind of night that promises adventure. My friends and I had been bored out of our minds. The usual spots weren't cutting it anymore, and we were craving something different. Something that would shake up the monotony of our routine. I was in my early 20s, a time in life when a little thrill can make you feel alive. I was with a group of 4 others. We weren't strangers to the spooky side of life. We'd spent countless weekends roaming through forests, looking for haunted houses, or even visiting old cemeteries at night, just to see if we could catch a glimpse of something out of place. But this was different. This wasn't just any old haunted spot. This place had been abandoned for years, and the stories surrounding it were enough to make anyone think twice. The amusement park had once been a thriving hotspot. Kids laughing, families enjoying their day, roller coasters whipping by in a blur of excitement. That is, until one night when something went terribly wrong. A tragic accident occurred that shook the community to its core. The park closed shortly after, and it was left to decay, untouched by time. We'd heard the stories, of course. People talked about strange sounds coming from the rusted Ferris wheel in the dead of night, about flickers of lights that no one could explain, and about shadows moving across the park when no one was there. But we were young. We didn't believe in the supernatural. We thought it was all just overhyped nonsense. So, one late evening, when the moon hung high in the sky and the wind felt just a bit too still, we made our decision. We were going to go. Our crew that night consisted of me, Ben, Leela, Nate, and Priya. Ben was the self-proclaimed leader of our group, the one who always had a plan, whether it was a good plan or not. Leela was the skeptic, always questioning the weird things we came across, the one who would argue with Ben when he got too carried away. Nate was a bit of a wild card, ready to jump into anything without thinking of the consequences. Priya, though, was the glue that held us together. She was always calm and composed, which, in a group like ours, was a rarity. We all piled into my car, ready for whatever the night would throw our way. The drive to the amusement park took about half an hour. The road leading up to it was long and winding, cutting through thick trees and veering off into the unknown. The streetlights grew sparse the farther we got from town, and the darkness swallowed everything around us. The closer we got, the more tension built in the car. Even Ben, who'd been excited about the adventure, started to fall quiet. "This place is supposed to be bad news," Leela said, breaking the silence. She always did that when the mood shifted. "You know, for a reason. I wasn't scared. I just didn't believe the rumors. What could an abandoned amusement park really do? People had walked through places like this before, and no one had come back with anything more than a few bumps and bruises. It was just a decaying structure." But as we pulled up to the entrance, the sight of the park sent a chill down my spine. The gates were wide open, hanging off their hinges, as if they hadn't been touched in years. The faded sign that once proclaimed the park's name was barely visible in the darkness, the letters barely legible from years of neglect. I turned off the engine, and for a moment, we all sat there in the quiet of the night, staring at the towering roller coaster that loomed in front of us. There was no sound, no laughter, no screams of excitement, just the eerie quiet of a place long forgotten. The wind rustled through the trees, making the leaves sway and adding an unnatural hiss to the otherwise still air. "Well, this is it," Ben said with a smirk, opening the car door. "Let's see what this place is really made of." We grabbed our flashlights and stepped out of the car, the ground crunching beneath our feet as we walked toward the gates. The air was thick with humidity, and the smell of decay and rust lingered around us. "You know," Priya said, her voice almost a whisper, "I read that there are rumors about this place. Some people say it's cursed." "Cursed? Really?" Nate scoffed. "Sounds like something out of a bad movie." Leela shushed him, her eyes scanning the darkened park. "There's something off about this place, though. I can feel it." She had a point. The air felt heavy, as if something was waiting just beyond the shadows. We ignored the warning signs and pushed forward, entering the park. The sound of our footsteps echoed in the empty space, bouncing off the cracked pavement and worn-out structures. It felt wrong, not in the way a normal creepy place feels, but in a deeper, unsettling way. It wasn't just the fact that it was abandoned, it was something more, something that we couldn't yet explain. As we walked deeper into the park, the sounds of the outside world seemed to fade away. The only thing that remained was the sound of our breathing and the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind swept through the park. The silence was unnerving. There was something about it, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. We passed the old food stalls, their windows shattered and the signs hanging limp. The roller coaster loomed above us, its tracks twisting and turning in the dark, abandoned to time. But it was the Ferris wheel that caught my attention. It was still, but for some reason, it didn't feel right. I couldn't explain it, but something about the way it stood there, towering over us, felt like it was watching us. "Let's head to the main building," Ben suggested, pulling me out of my thoughts. We all nodded in agreement, although there was an unease settling over all of us. As we walked toward the old building, the wind picked up, sending a gust through the air that made the trees sway and the branches creak. It was the first real sign that something was wrong. But we kept walking, determined to get to the heart of the park. Little did we know that our decision to step into that abandoned amusement park would soon lead us down a path that none of us were prepared for. The kind of path that would challenge everything we thought we knew about fear and force us to face something that couldn't be explained away by logic or reason. We hadn't been in the park for more than 15 minutes, but already the atmosphere felt thick with something we couldn't quite place. There was a strange sense of weight in the air, as though the very ground we were walking on was holding its breath. The wind had died down again, leaving us with only the distant sounds of our footsteps, the occasional creak of an old wooden structure, and the rustling of leaves. It was unsettling, but at the same time, we tried to brush it off as just our imaginations running wild in the dark. Ben led the way, as usual, with that half-confident, half-nervous swagger of someone who had no idea what was really waiting ahead, but still wanted to act like they did. Priya and Leela followed close behind, whispering among themselves, no doubt debating whether we should be here or not. Nate was a few steps behind them, talking loudly, almost to himself, making jokes to break the tension that was slowly building. I stayed a little farther back, allowing the others to take the lead. There was something about the place that made me want to hang back and observe, to listen to the sounds, the silence, the air that felt like it was holding something secret. We walked deeper into the park, making our way past the dilapidated food stalls and overturned benches until we reached the old building near the center of the grounds. It was an enormous structure, once a lively place of laughter and games, now nothing more than a shadow of its former self. The walls were cracked, and the windows were either boarded up or shattered entirely. Yet, as I looked at it, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us, hidden behind the broken glass or the decaying walls. "I'll check the door," Ben said, walking ahead and pushing on the rusted handle of the main entrance. It creaked, loud in the otherwise silent night, as the door reluctantly gave way, and he stepped inside. The rest of us hesitated for a moment before following him. The dark interior was even more eerie than the exterior. There were remnants of what seemed to be old carnival games, faded and forgotten. A claw machine, half broken, sat in the corner, its glass cracked and empty. The air inside smelled stale, musty, as if it hadn't been touched in years. We all pulled our flashlights from our pockets, their beams cutting through the thick shadows. The flashlight beams bounced off the walls, revealing peeling paint and piles of old debris, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. At least, not yet. We moved further into the building, our footsteps echoing, the silence only broken by the soft hum of our breathing. But then, something strange happened. As we neared the far end of the building, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It wasn't anything tangible at first, just a feeling that something wasn't right, like the air had changed in an almost imperceptible way. I stopped in my tracks, the others following suit, their expressions puzzled. "What's wrong?" Nate asked, looking back at me. I don't know," I muttered, scanning the area. The place was cold, much colder than it should have been, especially for a summer night. The chills seemed to settle on my skin, seeping into my bones. I was shivering, but I couldn't tell if it was from the temperature or the growing unease. Leela stepped closer, her eyes narrowed in suspicion. Did anyone hear that? We all fell silent, straining our ears. At first, there was nothing, just the silence that hung heavily in the air. Then, faintly, we heard a soft, rhythmic tapping sound coming from somewhere deep in the building. It was slow at first, almost like footsteps, but it wasn't the sound of someone walking. It was different. The pattern was too irregular, too random. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe it was the building settling, or the wind playing tricks on us. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The sound was coming from the far end of the room, near the broken windows, where the faintest light filtered through the cracks in the wall. "That's not normal," Ben said, his voice unusually quiet for once. He shifted his weight, looking at each of us for reassurance. "Maybe it's an animal," Priya suggested, though her voice lacked its usual calm. But I could tell she didn't believe that. Neither did I. Nate, ever the brave one, took a step forward. "Let's go check it out." "I'll go first." Before any of us could protest, he was already moving toward the source of the sound, his flashlight beam sweeping across the ground. The rest of us hesitated, exchanging glances before reluctantly following. The tapping continued, faster now, more insistent. As we drew closer, the air seemed to grow even colder, the temperature dropping so suddenly that I could see my breath in the dim light. I shivered, goosebumps breaking out on my skin. Then, without warning, the tapping stopped. I froze, heart racing, as a tense silence filled the room. It was as if whatever had been making the noise was now waiting for us, watching us. I felt my stomach twist, and for a moment, I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot. Ben cleared his throat, trying to shake off the fear that was creeping up on all of us. "All right, that's enough," he said, trying to sound braver than he felt. "We've heard it. Let's go back outside." But as he turned to walk back toward the door, the silence was broken by a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a low, guttural growl, something that sounded almost human, but twisted and distorted. I whipped around, my flashlight beam jerking toward the noise, but there was nothing there. Just the empty room, the broken machines, the peeling walls. "What was that?" Priya whispered, her voice trembling. We all stood there, frozen, trying to process what had just happened. The growl had been so real, so close, but nothing was there. It was like the room itself was playing tricks on us. "We need to get out of here," Leela said, her voice rising with panic. "Now." But before we could move, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway just beyond the room. Heavy footsteps, too slow to be human, but unmistakable. Something or someone was approaching, and it was coming closer. "Get to the door," Ben shouted, turning and running back toward the exit. We didn't waste any time following him, the fear rising in our throats as we sprinted back to the door. But as I reached the threshold, I glanced back once more, my flashlight briefly illuminating the dark hallway behind us. For just a split second, I thought I saw someone in the shadows. Something moving, too fast, too fluid. My heart skipped a beat. Then, without a second thought, I bolted out of the building, slamming the door behind me. We all stood there, panting, outside in the cool night air, too scared to speak, too afraid to even look back. We didn't know what we had heard or seen, or what had been following us through the building. But one thing was certain. Something in that park was not right. And whatever it wasn't done with us yet. We stood outside the park for what felt like an eternity, the cold night air wrapping around us like a suffocating blanket. None of us spoke immediately, all of us too shaken to form words. Our minds were racing, trying to make sense of what had happened in that building. We were safe now, but something told me this wasn't over. The night felt far too still, the air too thick, and the park behind us seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for something. Ben was the first to break the silence, his voice low, almost cautious. "Maybe we should leave. This place it's not right." I agreed with him. Every instinct told me to turn around, to get as far away as possible from that abandoned park. But there was something gnawing at me, an unsettling feeling that I couldn't shake. I looked over at Priya and Leela, who were still standing by the gate, their eyes wide, faces pale. They looked just as terrified as I felt. "Yeah," Priya muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "But what the hell was that growl? And those footsteps? They were right behind us." Leela shook her head, her eyes darting nervously back toward the dark shadows of the park. "I don't know, but I don't feel safe here. We should just go home." And yet, as we stood there debating whether to leave or not, I couldn't help but glance back over my shoulder. The park seemed alive in a way I couldn't explain. The buildings, the rides, the ruins, all of it was shrouded in darkness, but somehow it felt like the place itself was watching us, waiting. "We're not leaving," Ben said suddenly, his voice firm. "Not yet. We came here to figure out what's going on, and we're not just going to walk away because we're scared." I wanted to argue, to beg him to reconsider, but there was something in his tone that made me hesitate. Ben's stubbornness had always been one of his defining traits. Once he set his mind to something, there was no changing it. And in that moment, I realized that we weren't leaving until we found answers whether we wanted to or not. I reluctantly followed him back into the park, the others trailing behind. The moment we crossed the gate again, a wave of unease washed over me. The place felt different, like it had transformed somehow in the time we'd spent outside. The temperature had dropped even further, and a thick fog had begun to roll in, swirling around our feet as we walked. The beams of our flashlights sliced through the mist, but it only seemed to make the shadows deeper, the night darker. "This is insane," Nate muttered, his voice cracking as we moved toward the entrance of the old building. "Why are we doing this? This is not fun anymore." "Because we need answers," Ben snapped, but there was an edge to his voice now, a strain that hadn't been there before. As we entered the building again, the chill inside seemed even more intense. The cold seemed to seep into our skin, making our teeth chatter despite our best efforts to stay calm. The once familiar surroundings now felt even more alien. The debris scattered across the floor seemed to have shifted while we were outside, and the sense of being watched intensified with every step. We made our way to the back of the building, to the area where we had heard the strange tapping and growling earlier. This time, as we walked, the floorboards creaked beneath our feet, almost as though the building itself was protest our presence. The smell of mildew was overpowering, and I could taste the dampness in the air as it made its way into my lungs. Then, just as we reached the same corner where the sounds had come from, something new happened. A faint noise, almost like a soft dragging sound, came from the darkness ahead. It was subtle at first, just the slightest shift of something scraping against the floor. But as we stood there, listening, it grew louder, more distinct. I turned to the others, my heart pounding in my chest. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible in the oppressive silence. They all nodded, their eyes wide with fear. Ben stepped forward, his flashlight beam shaking slightly in his hand. He moved cautiously, but with purpose, toward the source of the sound. As we followed him, I noticed that the walls seemed to close in around us, the space growing tighter, more suffocating with every step. The dragging sound continued, but now it was joined by another noise. A faint, high-pitched giggle, barely audible, but enough to make my stomach churn. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end as I glanced around, trying to make sense of what was happening. "What the hell was that?" Priya asked, her voice trembling. She was standing too close to me now, her arm brushing mine, but I didn't have the heart to push her away. I could feel her fear radiating off her, and my own anxiety only deepened. "I don't know," I said, my voice shaking, "but I don't like it." Suddenly, the dragging sound stopped. There was a moment of complete silence. Nothing moved, nothing creaked, nothing breathed. I took a step forward, my feet almost unwilling to move as I pushed my way deeper into the shadows. The flashlight beam cut through the dark, but there was nothing there. No movement, no figure lurking in the corner. Just the broken walls and the stillness of the building. But then, out of nowhere, a loud crash echoed from the back of the room, followed by a sudden burst of static. It was as though a loudspeaker had been activated, but there was no one around to turn it on. The sound sent all of us jumping back, our hearts racing, our breaths coming in shallow gasps. My flashlight beam flickered, then died, leaving us in total darkness. I fumbled for my spare flashlight, my hands trembling, and finally managed to turn it on again. But when the beam flickered to life, it illuminated something that made my stomach twist. There, at the far end of the room, standing in the shadow of the wreckage, was a figure. A tall, thin figure, wearing tattered clothing. It was unmoving, just standing there, staring at us with hollow, empty eyes. I felt my blood freeze in my veins. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. I could only stare at the figure, my breath catching in my throat as the light seemed to flicker in and out. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching us. "What is that?" Leela whispered, her voice shaking with fear. Before anyone could answer, the figure slowly lifted its hand and pointed toward us. The gesture was deliberate, slow, and unnatural. My heart slammed against my chest, my mind screaming at me to run, to get out of there. But we were frozen in place, too terrified to move. The figure's outstretched hand still lingered in the air, its pale, bony fingers pointing directly at us as if it had singled us out for some horrifying reason. The tension in the room was so thick, it felt as though it could choke the very breath from our lungs. I couldn't even process what was happening. Everything had gone completely wrong. My mind was scrambling to understand, but nothing made sense. The silence felt suffocating, as if the world around us had stopped spinning, leaving us suspended in time with that thing in front of us. I heard Priya take a sharp breath beside me, her voice barely a whisper. "We need to get out of here. Now." Ben, usually the one to hold it together, was visibly shaking. His flashlight flickered nervously as he gripped it tighter, his hands trembling with the force of his fear. His voice came out strained and broken. "I don't think we can. Not now." I tried to speak, but my throat had gone dry. I couldn't make a sound. My heart was pounding in my chest, each beat like a drum that echoed in the silence of the room. I glanced at the others. Priya was pale, her eyes wide with terror. Leela was frozen in place, her hand pressed to her mouth, as if trying to suppress the scream that was threatening to break free. But it wasn't until I looked back at the figure that the full weight of our situation hit me. The figure, standing motionless in the corner of the room, was no longer a mere shadow or a trick of the light. It was real, a thing that was as out of place as it was terrifying. The moment its fingers pointed at us, I realized something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't just some abandoned creature or leftover remnant of the park. No, this was something far worse. Something that had been waiting for us. Ben stepped forward, his voice breaking the eerie silence. "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure didn't respond, of course. It simply stood there, its hollow eyes fixed on us. But that was when something else happened. The temperature in the room dropped even further. My breath formed visible clouds in the air, and I could see the others shivering, trying to keep warm but failing. I could feel the weight of the cold in my bones, as if the very room was trying to freeze us in place. Then, as if responding to Ben's question, the figure slowly moved. Its head tilted unnaturally to the side, and with a jerking motion, it began to take a single step forward. The sound of its feet dragging on the floor echoed in the room, sending a chill down my spine. Its movements were deliberate, and though it was slow, it felt like it was coming at us with terrifying inevitability. My heart skipped a beat as it took another step, its head never moving, its empty gaze still locked onto us. I could feel my stomach twist into a knot as the figure closed the distance. There was no escape. We were trapped, the exit too far, the walls too close. The space we were in felt smaller now, as if it was closing in on us. The figure was so close now that I could hear its breath if it even breathed. It was a low, wheezing sound, like the wind through the cracks of a forgotten, long-abandoned house. "We need to run," Leela whispered urgently, her voice barely audible above the pounding of my heart. Her eyes were wide, and her face was pale, drenched in sweat despite the cold. I could see the terror on her face, the raw, unfiltered fear that reflected my own thoughts. But before any of us could move, the figure stopped in its tracks. It tilted its head once more, almost as if listening to something far away. And then, without warning, it spoke. The voice that came from its mouth wasn't human. It was guttural, distorted, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep, far beneath the earth. It rasped out in a single, chilling sentence. "You shouldn't have come." The words sent a shock through me, like a bolt of lightning hitting the ground. The air around us seemed to tremble as if the building itself was reacting to the figure's presence. I could see the fear reflected in the other's eyes, but for me, the words struck something deeper, something primal. I wasn't just scared anymore, I was paralyzed, unable to think, unable to react. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. All I could do was stare at the thing that stood before us, the darkness in its eyes, swallowing everything in its path. As if on cue, the lights in the room flickered violently, casting rapid strobe-like shadows against the walls. The figure's movements were becoming faster, jerky, and unnatural. It seemed to grow more erratic, as though it was being pushed beyond its limits. Priya, with a surge of panic, bolted toward the door. "Run!" she screamed. "Run!" The sound of her voice broke the trance, and suddenly we were all moving. Ben, Leela, and I rushed toward the exit, but as we turned to run, the door slammed shut with a force that shook the building. It felt like the whole structure was shaking, vibrating under some unseen pressure. "We're not getting out," Ben shouted, his voice filled with desperation. "We're trapped." I didn't have time to respond. The figure was behind us now, its presence suffocating. its wheezing breaths growing louder and more intense. My heart was racing, and my legs were moving as if on instinct, carrying me away from it, despite my mind screaming that we would never make it out alive. Then, in a blur of motion, the figure lunged toward us. It moved with unnatural speed, a blur of pale skin and tattered clothing. I heard a scream, but I didn't know if it was my own or someone else's. I turned back just in time to see its face, the hollow, empty eyes staring straight into mine. In that moment, I felt a cold, paralyzing grip seize my chest. My breath caught in my throat, and my body stopped moving. It was like the very air had been sucked out of the room, replaced by the terrifying presence of the figure that towered over us. I wanted to fight, to scream, but it was too late. It had already made its move. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the figure's hand reaching out toward me, its fingers so close that I could almost feel them brush against my skin. The last thing I felt before losing consciousness was the chilling touch of the figure's hand, brushing against my skin like a cold gust of wind from the grave. For a brief moment, I thought I might slip away entirely, disappear into the darkness that surrounded me, but something primal kept me tethered to the world. When I woke, I was lying on the cold concrete floor of the amusement park, my body aching as if I had been struck by some unseen force. The air around me was thick with dust and the lingering, oppressive weight of what had happened. My heart was still racing, my breath shallow and rapid as I forced myself to sit up, trying to orient myself. Everything felt surreal, like a nightmare that I couldn't escape from. But what truly shook me was the silence. The figure, whatever it was gone. The room, once filled with its haunting presence, was now eerily still. I could feel the absence of its malice in the air, but it wasn't a comforting stillness. It was like the calm before the storm, or perhaps the calm after something terrible had already passed through. I tried to stand, but my legs were weak, trembling from the fear and exhaustion that had settled into my bones. My vision blurred for a moment, but I managed to steady myself, my hand brushing against the rough surface of the wall. As my mind tried to piece together what had happened, I could barely focus. My thoughts were a jumble of fragments, each one tied to the events that had led me here. It took me a few moments before I realized I wasn't alone. Priya, Ben, and Leela were sprawled out around me, equally disoriented and shaken. Priya was the first to stir, groaning softly as she pushed herself up, her face pale and stricken with shock. "Are we alive?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I think so," I replied, my throat dry. I still couldn't believe it. Everything had happened so quickly, so violently. It didn't make sense. The figure, its chilling presence, the door slamming shut. It all felt like a dream. But the pain in my body, the terror that still clung to me, reminded me that it wasn't. Ben was already on his feet, his face grim and bloodshot. His usual confidence had evaporated, replaced by the kind of vulnerability I'd never seen in him before. "Where is it? The thing? Did we make it out?" Leela was still lying on the floor, her chest heaving with shallow breaths. "What happened?" I remember. "The door. And then—" "We need to leave," Priya interrupted, her voice firm despite the fear that still lingered in her eyes. "Now. Whatever that was, it's gone for now, but we can't stay here. Not another second." I nodded, the urgency in her voice cutting through the haze of confusion. I had no idea what we had just faced, or if it was truly gone, but the fear of being trapped here any longer was unbearable. We managed to stand, each of us supporting the other as we made our way toward the exit. The building seemed to shift around us, the walls feeling tighter, the air thicker, as if it were trying to keep us inside. The fluorescent lights flickered above, casting long, distorted shadows along the walls. But there was no sign of the figure. No sign of anything other than the haunting remnants of what we had just experienced. As we reached the door, the lock that had once kept us trapped was now undone. It was almost too easy. The door creaked open, and the cold night air rushed in, filling my lungs with a sense of relief. We didn't hesitate. We stepped out into the darkened parking lot, away from the monstrous ruin of the amusement park. But even as we walked toward the safety of the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us. Something had seen us, and it was waiting. None of us spoke for a long time. The drive back to the city was silent, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional gust of wind that rattled the car. The others were visibly shaken, lost in their own thoughts, but I couldn't stop replaying the events in my mind. The figure's voice, its touch, the way it had seemed to know exactly what we were doing, where we were. It felt like a warning, but of what? That thought gnawed at me, even as I tried to force it out of my mind. By the time we reached the city, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. The streets were empty, the world around us quiet, almost as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew it had. We all did. When we finally arrived at my place, I stumbled out of the car, my legs weak beneath me. Ben, Priya, and Leela followed, their faces drained of color, their eyes hollow. We didn't speak as we gathered inside. The moment we stepped through the door, it felt like a weight had lifted from our shoulders, but the questions remained. What had we encountered? Was it really over? I tried to sleep, but the nightmares started almost immediately. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure, its cold, dead eyes staring back at me. The door slamming shut, its voice cutting through the silence. It was never truly gone, not in my mind, not in any of our minds. We never spoke about it again, not in detail, not with anyone. The city continued to bustle around us, and life carried on as if the horrors of that night had never happened. But for the four of us, something had changed. The memories lingered, haunting us, a reminder that there are things in the world that don't fade with time, that there are places like that abandoned amusement park that carry with them a darkness that will never let go. The question remained, was it truly over? Or had we only just scratched the surface of something much worse? The events of that night never truly left us. No matter how far we moved from that haunted amusement park, no matter how many days passed, there was always something lingering in the back of my mind. It wasn't just the fear that stayed with us. It was the questions, the unsettling sense that we had touched something ancient, something that didn't belong in this world. We all tried to move on, to pretend like it hadn't happened, but it was impossible to ignore the changes in us. Priya became more withdrawn, her bright spark of energy dimmed by something darker that I couldn't quite place. Ben, once the strong one, was often lost in thought, his eyes distant, haunted by the memory of what he'd seen. Leela, quiet and withdrawn, stopped coming around as much. We all withdrew in our own way, the shared trauma of that night hanging over us like an invisible shroud. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't a constant sensation, but every now and then, when I was walking down the street or sitting alone in my apartment, I would feel it, those cold eyes on me, that sense of being followed. But every time I turned around, there was nothing, just the quiet, empty spaces of the world. I began to wonder if we had done something to anger whatever force had haunted that place. Did it follow us home? Had we been marked? These thoughts haunted me, and I couldn't share them with anyone. I couldn't bring myself to ask the others if they still felt it too. I was too afraid of the answer. One evening, months later, I found myself back at the edge of the city, driving past the same spot where the amusement park had stood. I hadn't been able to let it go, this nagging feeling, this compulsion to understand what had happened. It was as if I couldn't find peace without knowing the truth, without understanding the thing that had haunted us. I pulled over and parked the car by the overgrown path that once led to the entrance. The amusement park was long gone, reduced to rubble, just like everything else in that area. No signs remained, no memories. It was as if the park had never existed, yet the feeling lingered heavy and oppressive, like a dark cloud just waiting to break. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space. The wind blew through the overgrown weeds, and the night was unnaturally still. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. A strange, unsettling feeling crept over me. It was the same sensation I'd felt that night, like something was watching, something just beyond my reach. Then, just as I was about to turn and leave, something caught my eye. It was faint, but it was there. In the distance, in the shadows where the ruins of the amusement park had once been, I saw a figure. Its outline was blurred, just like the figure we had seen that night. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, the breath caught in my throat. I couldn't make out its features, but I didn't need to. I knew. It was the same thing, the same presence that had haunted us. I didn't wait around to investigate. The terror that gripped me was immediate. I turned and ran back to the car, my legs shaking, my chest tight with fear. I didn't look back. I couldn't. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a dark shape lingering in the distance, watching me. But when I looked again, there was nothing. Just the empty road and the cold, distant night. I haven't been back to that place since. I haven't talked to the others either. I don't know where they are or what they've been through. But I can't escape the feeling that what we encountered that night wasn't just some stray spirit or haunted building. No, whatever it was something much older. It was a force that had been waiting for something for us, for the right moment to make itself known. And it's still out there. I don't know if it's watching me, waiting for the right time to strike again, or if it's moved on, but I feel it every day. The fear, the uncertainty, the questions that never get answered. Maybe I'll never know the truth. Maybe I'm better off not knowing. But one thing is certain. There are places in this world where the veil between the living and the dead is thin, where the past hasn't quite let go. And if you're not careful, you might just find yourself wandering too close to something you can never escape. It all began a few years ago. I had just come back from a business trip, exhausted and ready to settle back into my routine. My phone buzzed with a message from an old friend, Paul, who I hadn't seen in years. We had worked together in the past, and though we drifted apart, I'd always considered him a good companion. "Hey, you still in town? I found this weird little hotel that might be worth checking out. Let me know if you want to join me." At first, I thought he was joking, but the idea of a small getaway intrigued me. It had been a while since I'd had time off, and the thought of a weekend away from the city sounded like a good idea. Plus, Paul was known for seeking out obscure, offbeat places. I figured this would be no different, an odd little motel on the outskirts of town, maybe in need of a little renovation. We agreed to meet at the hotel that Friday evening. The location was a bit of a mystery. Paul had mentioned it was an old, forgotten building in the countryside, well away from the main road. As I drove there, the path grew more winding, the scenery more isolated, and the daylight began to fade. The road seemed to stretch forever, with only the occasional rustle of wind and distant bird calls keeping me company. The GPS kept cutting in and out, leaving me questioning whether I was still on the right track. It wasn't until I saw the hotel's dimly lit sign in the distance that I realized I had arrived. The hotel was older than anything I had expected. The exterior had seen better days. The once white facade had faded to a grimy yellow, and vines were creeping up the walls like an unwanted guest. The parking lot was empty, save for a few cars parked near the entrance. The air smelled musty, thick with the remnants of time and decay. As I entered, the bell on the door rang softly, and I was greeted by an almost oppressive silence. A man behind the desk, who seemed to be the only one present, looked up from his book. He gave me a warm smile and checked me in without asking for much information. Something about him felt a bit off, but I couldn't quite place it. "Your room's ready," he said. "Room 201. Right at the end of the hall." I nodded and took the key. My footsteps echoed in the empty corridor as I made my way to the room. I could feel the years of neglect in the creaking wooden floors, the smell of dust and stale air in the dim hallway. The lights flickered intermittently, casting strange shadows across the walls. When I finally reached the door, I unlocked it and stepped inside. The room was nothing special: old furniture, a bed covered in a faded quilt, and a small, cracked mirror. The walls were painted in a dull green that made the place feel even more claustrophobic. There was a window that overlooked the dark landscape outside. I tossed my bags on the bed and went to the bathroom to freshen up. It was then that I noticed something strange. In the bathroom, the mirror was fogged, despite the room being cold and the window open. I wiped it with my hand, but instead of clearing up, the fog seemed to settle back in, as if it was refusing to leave. A chill ran down my spine, and I found myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting someone to be standing behind me. I shook the feeling off and headed back to the room. Paul hadn't arrived yet, but I wasn't too concerned. He'd always been a bit of a wanderer, getting sidetracked by little things along the way. I settled down into an armchair by the window and began to relax, letting the stillness of the hotel soak into my bones. Everything was quiet, almost eerily so, the kind of silence you feel in your gut. An hour passed, maybe two, before Paul finally arrived. He looked as though he had been driving for much longer than he had planned, his clothes rumpled, a tired look in his eyes. "You weren't kidding about this place," I said as I stood up to greet him. "Yeah, it's a little more offbeat than I thought," he replied with a chuckle. He looked around the room, his eyes lingering on the dark corners, as though he was already uncomfortable. "But I like it. Feels like it's from another time." We sat down to talk, the conversation flowing as easily as it always had. But there was something unsettling about the way the night crept in around us. The temperature seemed to drop, and the silence was thick, almost suffocating. Every once in a while, I would glance over at the window, where I thought I saw a shadow move just outside. I convinced myself it was nothing, just my eyes playing tricks on me. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more it seemed to linger. As we spoke, we noticed the same strange flickering lights in the hallway that I had seen earlier. The flicker came in waves, casting shifting shadows through the cracks in the door. At one point, Paul excused himself to go for a walk, and I was left alone in the room. It was then that I heard something strange, a soft tapping. Faint, almost like someone was knocking on the door, but when I got up to check, there was no one there. I opened the door, half expecting Paul to be standing outside, but instead I was greeted by the same empty hallway, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of the overhead lights. The sound came again, but this time from further down the hall. I stepped into the hallway, the floorboards creaking underfoot. I stood there for a few moments, straining to listen, but there was only silence. I closed the door and sat back down, trying to shake off the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Paul returned shortly after, his face pale. "You'll never guess what I saw," he said, a tremor in his voice. "What is it?" I asked, worried that his disheveled appearance meant he had experienced something unsettling. "I was walking past room 202, and I saw something through the window, someone maybe, standing there, just staring out. The light flickered, and when it came back on, there was no one there." My stomach twisted. The hotel felt more wrong by the minute. But the night was far from over. The night pressed on, and the strange atmosphere in the hotel only deepened. Paul and I had tried to brush off our unease. After all, it was just an old building, and old buildings often come with creaks, groans, and odd sounds. But something about this place felt different. The silence was oppressive, like the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. We tried to distract ourselves, sitting together in the small sitting area of the room, laughing over some old stories from our past. The sound of our voices filled the room, momentarily pushing away the discomfort. But it didn't take long before we both noticed that the air in the room had become heavy, thick, like something was pressing in from all sides. The lights flickered again, and this time I felt it. Something in the air shifted, a subtle change I couldn't explain. A shiver ran down my spine, and for a brief moment I could have sworn I heard a faint whisper. It was barely audible, just a soft murmur that seemed to float in from somewhere beyond the room. I froze, my eyes darting toward the door, then to Paul, who had stopped speaking mid-sentence. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice lower than usual. Paul's face was pale, his eyes wide as he slowly nodded. "Yeah, I heard it too." I could feel my heart beat a little faster, the hairs on the back of my neck standing at attention. We both sat there in silence, listening intently, but the whispering had stopped, leaving only the silence that followed. "Probably just the wind," I muttered, trying to convince myself more than Paul. "Old building, old windows. You know how it is." Paul didn't respond right away. He was staring at the door now, as if waiting for something to happen. I could see the unease in his eyes. He wasn't buying the wind explanation. "I don't know, man. That didn't sound like wind," he said, his voice quiet but shaky. I stood up, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling that had started to creep into my chest. "All right, let's take a look around. We'll check the hall and see if anything's out of place." With a deep breath, I walked toward the door and opened it, stepping out into the dimly lit hallway. The hallway stretched long and narrow, the flickering lights casting long shadows that danced eerily along the cracked walls. I paused for a moment, listening carefully, but all I could hear was the distant sound of water dripping somewhere in the building. "See? Just old pipes or something," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. But Paul wasn't convinced. He was still staring down the hallway, a strange look on his face. That wasn't just the pipes, though. It was like something was trying to get our attention. I chuckled nervously, but the unease in my stomach only grew. We moved further down the hall, our footsteps muffled on the worn carpet. As we passed the room next door, I noticed something strange. The door to room 202, the one Paul had mentioned earlier, was slightly ajar. It hadn't been that way when we first arrived, and it certainly hadn't been opened when we walked by earlier. I stepped closer, squinting through the crack in the door, trying to see if anyone was inside. "Hey, Paul," I whispered, nodding toward the door. "That door wasn't open before, right?" Paul's eyes darted to the door, his face growing even paler. "No, it definitely wasn't." We stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. My heart was pounding in my chest now, my pulse quickening as I felt the oppressive atmosphere of the hotel press in on us from all sides. I didn't want to open the door, didn't want to find out what was behind it, but the curiosity gnawed at me. "Let's just take a quick look," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Before Paul could protest, I pushed the door open slightly. The hinges squeaked in protest, and we both flinched, our nerves on edge. The room inside was dark, the curtains drawn tightly against whatever light might have been coming in from the outside. The only sound was the steady ticking of a clock somewhere in the room. But there was something else, something that made my skin crawl, a strange cold air that seemed to seep from within, as if the room had been sealed off from the rest of the hotel. I took a step inside, Paul hesitating behind me. The room looked empty at first glance, but as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a figure standing at the far side of the room, by the window, just standing there, facing the glass. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge us, but I could feel its presence, like it was aware of our every move. The hairs on my neck stood on end, and I took an instinctual step backward, my pulse racing. "Paul," I whispered, but he was already backing away, his face a mask of fear. We turned to leave, but just as I was about to shut the door, I heard a soft sound, a whisper, just like before. It wasn't coming from the figure in the room, though. It was coming from behind us, from the hallway. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. But there was nothing there. Paul grabbed my arm, his grip tight. "We need to go. Now." I didn't argue. We both hurried back to our room, and I slammed the door shut behind us, leaning against it as if that would somehow keep whatever we had just seen out. For a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other in silence. The room felt colder now, the air thick with an unspoken fear. The whispering from earlier still echoed in my ears, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, something that wasn't human. "What the hell was that?" Paul finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I said, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. "But I don't think we're alone here." We both sat down on the bed, not knowing what to do next. The silence between us was suffocating, and the weight of the hotel's presence felt unbearable. It wasn't just the building that felt off. It was something more, something deeper, something that had been here long before we ever arrived. And as we sat there, the faint sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway, slow and deliberate, as if someone or something was pacing just outside the door. I stood up, heart hammering in my chest, and I pressed my ear to the door, trying to listen. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and then, as if on cue, the lights flickered once more. There was no mistaking it now. We weren't alone. The tension in the air seemed to grow thicker with every passing hour. After the unsettling encounter with the room next door, Paul and I barely spoke, but we couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching us. The hotel, which had once felt like a forgotten relic of the past, now felt like a living, breathing entity. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, listening to our every move. The lights flickered more frequently now. At first, it was just a brief, almost imperceptible glitch, but soon it became a regular occurrence, sometimes flickering rapidly, other times dimming almost to darkness before returning to normal. I had to keep checking the bulbs, convinced the electricity was playing tricks on us, but everything seemed fine when I inspected the circuit box. It was as if the building itself had become a conduit for something else, something that had a mind of its own. The next morning, after an uneasy sleep, I decided to go downstairs and speak to the front desk clerk, hoping to get some answers. The lobby was eerily quiet, the air still and thick with dust. The front desk was unmanned, which only heightened my sense of unease. I stood there for a moment, considering my options, when I heard footsteps approaching from behind me. I spun around, expecting to see the clerk, but there was no one there. Only the faint sound of boots echoing across the empty floor. "Hello," I called out, my voice louder than I intended. Silence. It was the same silence that had plagued the hotel since our arrival, the kind of silence that seemed unnatural in its completeness. I turned back to the counter, my stomach twisting into knots. There was no sign of the clerk, no indication that anyone had been here recently. It was as if the building had swallowed him whole. When I returned to the room, Paul was sitting by the window, staring out at the overgrown courtyard below. His face was pale, his eyes wide and unblinking. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. I raised an eyebrow, stepping toward him. "What? The footsteps?" Paul nodded, his gaze not leaving the window. It wasn't just footsteps. I heard voices, faint like whispers. A chill ran through me. We hadn't been alone in the hotel for hours, but now, with the faint sound of voices swirling around us, the feeling of isolation had deepened. It was as if the hotel itself was trying to communicate, its walls groaning and shifting with some unseen force. "We're not alone," I muttered under my breath. Paul didn't say anything, but his eyes met mine, a look of terror in his gaze. We both knew what the other was thinking. Whatever was in this place, it wasn't going to let us leave without a fight. Later that evening, we decided to do something we should have done the moment we arrived. We began to explore the building. The halls were still and dark, the flickering lights casting long shadows across the walls. As we wandered deeper into the hotel, the atmosphere seemed to grow heavier, as though the building itself was resisting our presence. The silence was suffocating, but it was punctuated by strange sounds, soft creaks, distant whispers, and the occasional bang that came from somewhere above us. We approached the stairwell at the far end of the hall. The steps creaked under our feet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was following us. The dim light cast strange, wavering shadows against the walls, and every creak of the floorboards made my heart race. As we ascended to the next floor, the temperature seemed to drop, the air growing colder and colder with every step. When we reached the top of the stairs, we were met with a narrow hallway lined with doors. Most of them were shut tight, but there was one door at the very end of the hall that was ajar, just like the one from before. My breath caught in my throat. "I don't think we should go in there," Paul said, his voice shaking. But my curiosity got the best of me. Without responding, I stepped toward the door, and before Paul could stop me, I pushed it open. The room was dark, but I could make out the faint outline of furniture scattered throughout. It was eerily quiet, the only sound the distant hum of the building's aging heating system. The air inside the room was thick with dust, and the floorboards creaked under my feet as I took a step further inside. I could feel it, the presence, the coldness, the weight of something lurking just beyond the reach of my senses. The room felt wrong. Every instinct in me screamed to leave, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the shadows. Then, just as I was about to turn and walk out, the door slammed shut behind me. I whipped around, my heart hammering in my chest, and saw Paul's face pressed against the window, his eyes wide with fear. "Paul!" I shouted, pounding on the door. "Get me out of here!" I heard him yell something back, but the words were muffled by the thick wood. Desperation set in as I tugged at the handle, but the door wouldn't budge. That's when I saw it. A figure, pale and translucent, stepped out from the shadows at the far corner of the room. It was tall, unnaturally so, and its features were blurred, as if its very existence was fading in and out of reality. The air grew colder still, and I could see my breath clouding in front of me as I stood frozen in terror. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its presence press against me, pushing me further into the corner of the room. My legs felt like they were made of stone, and I couldn't look away. "Please." "No," I whispered, backing away slowly, my heart pounding so hard in my chest I thought it might burst. The figure reached out a hand, its fingers long and skeletal, but just before it touched me, the door flew open, and I was yanked from the room. Paul stood there, his face pale and wide-eyed, his hand gripping mine with a force I hadn't known he had. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice trembling. We didn't need to speak any more than that. We ran down the hall, barely stopping to check if the doors were locked behind us. The hotel was alive with strange noise, voices, footsteps, and the sound of something or someone scraping along the walls. We didn't know where we were going, but all I could think about was escaping. As we rushed down the stairs, I glanced back over my shoulder, my pulse pounding in my ears. That's when I saw it. A figure in the corner of the hallway, watching us, its face hidden in shadow, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. And it was moving toward us. The figure was getting closer. My heart raced, thumping in my chest like a drum. Each step I took down the hallway felt heavier than the last, as if the very air was pressing against me, slowing my movements. I couldn't take my eyes off it, even though every instinct screamed for me to look away, to run. But the figure, whatever it was growing stronger, its presence undeniable. It wasn't human. I knew that much. Its features were distorted, its shape ever-changing, as if reality itself was struggling to contain its form. At first, it looked like a man, tall and thin, but as it moved closer, it became something else entirely. Its limbs elongated unnaturally, twisting and bending in ways that defied logic. Its face remained hidden in the shadows, but I could feel its eyes, those burning, soulless eyes fixated on me. "Paul," I whispered, my voice barely audible. I turned to him, desperate for reassurance, but his face was pale, his mouth trembling. He couldn't look away either. The horror was reflected in his eyes, and I could see the realization dawning on him, just as it had on me. This thing, this creature, was not of this world. "Do you see it too?" I managed to choke out. Paul nodded, his voice caught in his throat. "We need to leave. Now." But we didn't move. Our feet were glued to the floor as the figure advanced, inch by agonizing inch. The temperature dropped further, a biting cold that made my skin feel like it was being scraped with ice. My breath formed clouds in front of me, and the sounds of the hotel, the creaking of the floorboards, the distant hum of the pipes, faded into a haunting silence, leaving only the steady, rhythmic sound of my own breathing and the slow shuffle of the figure's approach. Suddenly, it spoke. Its voice was a low, guttural whisper, barely discernible, as if coming from the very walls themselves. The words were incomprehensible, a string of syllables that twisted my mind and made my stomach churn. I could feel the weight of its voice pressing against my chest, suffocating me, drowning me in its darkness. "Run," Paul whispered, his voice barely a breath, but it was enough to snap me out of my paralysis. We turned and sprinted, but it was too late. The door at the end of the hallway slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping us inside. My pulse hammered in my ears as I stumbled backward, crashing into Paul. We both spun around, eyes wide in panic, looking for any escape. But there was nothing. The hallway stretched on forever, the walls closing in, the air thick with an oppressive force that made it hard to breathe. The figure was right behind us now. I didn't want to turn around, didn't want to see it, but I couldn't help myself. I glanced over my shoulder, and there it was so close I could feel its cold breath on my skin. Its features were clearer now, more defined. It had a face, but it wasn't a face at all. It was an empty void, a gaping hole where its features should have been. Its eyes, those eyes glowed with an unnatural light, a sickly yellow that pierced the darkness. It reached out a hand, long twisted fingers, and I could feel its touch without it even making contact. It was in my head. I screamed, but the sound was lost in the air. My voice was swallowed by the darkness, by the presence of the creature. It was too much. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't move. My body was frozen, trapped in a nightmare I couldn't escape. "Paul," I gasped, but the words barely made it past my lips. I looked at Paul, but he wasn't there anymore. His face was pale, his eyes wide, but he wasn't moving. He was staring at the creature, at the thing that was now standing directly in front of us. I wanted to scream, to pull him away, but my legs wouldn't obey. My body was paralyzed with fear, my muscles refusing to cooperate, as if the creature had taken control of me. I felt its presence now, seeping into my skin, crawling through my veins. It was inside me, consuming me from the inside out. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, until they drowned out everything else. The walls closed in, the ceiling descended, and the floor seemed to shift beneath my feet. I could feel it all, the weight, the pressure, the suffocating force of the hotel itself pressing against us, tightening its grip. Then, in the midst of it all, a voice broke through the chaos. A voice I didn't recognize, but it was familiar in its own way. It was a woman's voice, soft and comforting, but there was something wrong about it, something off. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "Leave. Now." The words were clear, but the tone was wrong. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't a plea. It was an order, a command. And it wasn't coming from the figure, but from the walls themselves. I spun around, searching for the source of the voice, but all I could see was darkness. The figure, the thing, was still there, its glowing eyes locked on me. But now there was something else, something more insidious lurking just beneath the surface of the shadows. The air around me seemed to crackle, charged with an energy that I couldn't understand. And then, without warning, the ground beneath us began to tremble. The hotel shook violently, and for a brief moment, everything seemed to freeze. The walls cracked, the ceiling buckled, and the entire building groaned as if it were alive. I stumbled, my legs failing me as I tried to regain my balance, but there was no stopping the force that was ripping the hotel apart. The creature, it wasn't the only one. The hotel itself had become something else, something dark and ancient, and it was waking up. "Paul, we have to get out. Now!" I screamed, but the words felt like they were being swallowed by the walls. I grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the stairs, but he didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the figure, and I knew he couldn't hear me anymore. He was lost. We were both lost. The creature's hand reached out, long fingers brushing against my skin, and I screamed in agony as its touch burned like ice. The pain was overwhelming, suffocating. It felt like my very soul was being ripped from my body, torn apart by the darkness that had been unleashed. I tried to fight back, tried to scream, but nothing came out. The hotel was no longer a building. It was a prison, a trap. For a moment, everything was eerily quiet, too quiet. My breath came in shallow gasps as I struggled to pull myself together. The darkness still hung heavily in the air, thick and suffocating, as if the very building had become a living entity, choking out any semblance of normalcy. I still felt the burn of the creature's touch seared into my skin. It was as though it had marked me, a brand that would never fade. And yet, amidst the chaos, I could feel something stirring deep within me, a sense of urgency, an instinct to survive. "Paul," I whispered, my voice barely audible. I turned toward him, my heart sinking in my chest. He was standing motionless in front of me, his eyes wide, fixed on nothing. His face was pale, drained of all color, as if the life had been sucked out of him. It was a look I recognized, one of complete horror, of someone who had seen too much. "Paul, we need to leave," I said, a sense of desperation creeping into my voice. "We need to get out of here. Now." But he didn't respond. I grabbed his arm, shaking him, trying to get him to react. His body felt cold, stiff, and his eyes, once filled with terror, were now glazed, staring into nothing. He wasn't here with me anymore. Whatever had happened in that hotel had taken hold of him, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of helplessness creeping in. The creature, or whatever it was, had claimed its first victim. I shook him harder, calling his name louder, but he didn't move. I could feel my panic rising, clawing at the edges of my mind. I couldn't leave him behind. I couldn't. But then, just as quickly as it had happened, the moment passed. Paul blinked, his eyes refocusing, and for a split second, there was a flicker of recognition in his gaze. He took a deep, shuddering breath, and the tension that had been holding him captive seemed to lift. I don't know what happened," he whispered, his voice trembling. "There's no time for explanations," I interrupted, pulling him toward the stairs. "We have to go." But the path to the exit wasn't as simple as it had been before. The hotel, now alive with a pulse of its own, seemed to have shifted, the walls changing, closing in on us with every step we took. The stairs that had once been our escape were now a twisted labyrinth, each door leading to another hallway, every corner more oppressive than the last. It was as though the building itself was trying to keep us inside. "We're not going to make it out, are we?" Paul's voice cracked. There was a note of surrender in it, a realization that I hadn't wanted to face. "We are," I said, my voice firm. "We have to." I didn't know if I believed my own words, but there was no other choice. I could feel the hotel's presence, suffocating us, pushing us closer to the brink. But I refused to let it win. I refused to let whatever had claimed Paul take me too. We pushed through the maze of hallways, each turn more unsettling than the last. I could feel the weight of the building pressing down on us, its walls pulsating like a beating heart. The windows, once clear, were now distorted, as though they had become a part of the hotel itself. They no longer showed the outside world, but only a swirling black void that seemed to stretch into infinity. And then we reached the front doors. They were no longer the solid, reassuring barrier they had once been. They were cracked, splintered, as though they had been torn apart by something unseen. But they were open. I hesitated, my hand on the door handle. The wind outside howled, as if warning us, but there was no turning back. We had come too far. I pushed the door open, and the night air hit me like a slap to the face. It was cold, sharp, and yet, somehow, it was the most welcome thing I had ever felt. We stepped outside into the quiet darkness of the night. The hotel loomed behind us, silent now, its oppressive weight gone. It was as though it had never been there at all. Paul and I stood in the cold for what felt like an eternity, neither of us saying a word. There were no sounds of footsteps behind us, no creatures lurking in the shadows. The nightmare was over. At least, that's what I wanted to believe. "Do you think it's over?" Paul finally spoke, his voice hollow. I didn't know how to answer. The hotel was gone, but the memories lingered, sharp and painful. It was as though we had left part of ourselves behind in that place, something that would never be recovered. "I don't know," I said, "but I don't think we'll ever truly know what happened in there." We stood there in the cold night, the weight of our experience settling on our shoulders. The streets were empty, quiet, as though the world had been altered in some unseen way. The echoes of the hotel's twisted halls still haunted me, the memory of its darkness still lingering in my mind. The questions remained. How had it all started? What had we encountered inside? And why had it all happened to us? But some questions, I realized, would never have answers. As the days passed, the memories of the abandoned hotel began to fade, or so I thought. It had been weeks since we'd left that cursed place behind us, and life, in a sense, had returned to normal. The chill of the night air, the unsettling silence of the hotel, those things slowly receded into the background, like a bad dream that eventually fades with time. But some things linger, no matter how much you wish them away. I found myself staring at the ceiling most nights, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. The peace I had once taken for granted was now a foreign concept, something I couldn't grasp. My nights were filled with restlessness, the shadows stretching across my room like they had in the hallways of that hotel. There were moments when I could almost feel the weight of that oppressive darkness pressing in on me, and I'd shake it off, telling myself it was all in my head. Paul, too, seemed different. The days he spent recovering, when we spoke of what had happened, were few and far between. He became withdrawn, quieter, and no matter how much I tried to reach out to him, there was always a wall between us. He never spoke about the hotel again, and I didn't push him to. But even in his silence, I knew he carried the same weight I did, the weight of the things we had seen, the things that had changed us. We were no longer the same people who had walked into that hotel. Whatever it was that had taken hold of us was still there, a shadow lingering just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Weeks turned into months, and I thought I could move on. I thought that perhaps the hotel had been nothing more than a twisted memory, a terrible chapter that would eventually close on its own. But it wasn't that simple. One night, as I was walking home from the store, I passed by an old, dilapidated building, one I'd never noticed before. Its windows were cracked, its bricks crumbling. I felt a strange pull toward it, an eerie familiarity that made my skin crawl. I stopped in front of the building and stared at it, my heart pounding in my chest. It was too familiar. It was the same design, the same eerie architecture, the same twisted windows that seemed to distort the world beyond them, the same feeling of wrongness. I wasn't sure how long I stood there, frozen, staring at the building. But then, it hit me like a punch to the gut. I wasn't standing in front of the hotel, but I could feel it. The same pulse, the same unnatural presence, emanated from this place, just as it had from the hotel. It was as though the hotel itself had followed me, had found a way to remain tethered to me, even after I thought I had escaped. I turned away from the building, my legs shaking beneath me. I couldn't breathe. I had to get away. Fast. I ran, not looking back, not daring to glance at the place that seemed to be waiting for me. The streets blurred around me, and I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't stop until I reached my apartment, where I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath. That night, I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence, that I was just imagining things. But deep down, I knew the truth. The hotel had never let me go. It had never released its grip on me, and now it was here again, in the most unexpected of places. The presence, the dark force that had consumed that hotel, was still out there, and it was following me. I never spoke to Paul again. I couldn't bring myself to. The distance between us had become too vast, and I knew that whatever had taken him in that hotel was still lurking inside him. I couldn't help him. We had both crossed a line, one that couldn't be uncrossed. The place had changed us, left marks on our souls that would never heal. I moved away shortly after, to a different town, far away from the familiar streets and memories that haunted me. I thought, perhaps, in a new place, I could start over. But I knew better. The truth was simple, even if it was hard to face. Some places never let go. Some things never truly leave you. The hotel had taken something from me, something I couldn't recover. It had taken my peace of mind, my sense of security, and replaced it with fear. I couldn't outrun that. And, deep down, I knew I never would. No matter how far I went, I would always carry the echoes of that place with me. The night, the shadows, the cold fingers that had brushed against my skin. They would remain with me, and I would never be free of them. I had just moved to a new town after a messy breakup, and the search for a stable job had turned into a daily grind. I was desperate for anything, really. I'd been living off my savings for a while, but those were quickly running out. Bills stacked up, and the pressure was starting to get to me. So, when I saw the job ad for a factory worker at an old industrial site just outside of town, I didn't hesitate to apply. The ad was simple. It said they were hiring someone for a night shift at a warehouse, and no prior experience was needed. They promised a competitive wage and flexible hours, which sounded like a dream at the time. After a brief interview, I was hired almost immediately. There was no mention of the factory's past, no talk of why it had been abandoned for so many years. But I was too desperate to care. The factory itself was a strange sight. It stood on the outskirts of town, long abandoned but still towering over everything else. From the moment I saw it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The brick walls, weathered by time, had a grayish tone, and the windows, most of them broken, gave the building an eerie, dilapidated look. The place felt like it had been forgotten by time itself, as though no one had dared to set foot inside for years. When I first arrived, I was introduced to the crew, 3 people, all older men who seemed to be as disinterested in the factory as I was. None of them spoke much. One man, a burly guy in his late 40s, just grunted as he handed me a safety vest and pointed me toward the old conveyor belt. "You'll be working here," he said in a low voice, without any real enthusiasm. "Don't touch anything that doesn't belong to you, and make sure the place is locked up before you leave. That's all you need to know." That was it. There was no formal training or orientation, just a cold, mechanical instruction. It wasn't exactly what I had hoped for in a new job, but the pay was decent, and the hours, well, they weren't too bad either. I was scheduled for the midnight shift, which I thought would be easy money. The factory was quiet at night, and it seemed like a perfect place to just get lost in my thoughts while I worked. The building's interior was just as unsettling as its exterior. Long, dark corridors stretched endlessly, with rusted machinery and dusty surfaces that hadn't seen any care in years. The air smelled musty, a mix of old metal and the faintest scent of something rotten. It was as if the factory had been sealed off from the world for decades. I was given the task of operating the conveyor belt that ran through one of the large storage rooms. My job was simple: make sure the line didn't get backed up and that everything moved smoothly. It was mundane, but I didn't mind. At first, the stillness of the factory was almost calming. There was something strangely peaceful about being in such an isolated place. The only sounds were the hum of the conveyor belt and the occasional creak of the building settling. But even in those first few nights, there was something off. I couldn't put my finger on it at the time. The factory had an unsettling presence that I couldn't quite shake. I would hear noises, footsteps echoing from the far halls when no one was there. A faint tapping sound on the metal walls, like someone was knocking. But every time I would investigate, the halls would be empty. One night, after a particularly long shift, I decided to walk around the building. I knew the factory well by now, but something inside me urged me to explore deeper, to see what was hidden in the shadows of those abandoned rooms. I walked through the halls, trying to push down the gnawing feeling of unease that had started to settle in my chest. The darkness felt heavier as I ventured further, and the building seemed to groan under the weight of its own age. It was as though the place was alive, watching me. The walls, lined with dusty old pipes and beams, looked as if they had stories to tell. And yet, none of them were willing to speak. The factory felt empty, devoid of any life. But then, just as I was about to turn back, I heard something. A soft whisper that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It wasn't in a language I recognized, but the tone was unmistakable, cold, distant, and hollow. I froze in place. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and the whisper grew louder. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like a warning, a cry for help from somewhere deep within the building. My heart raced, and I quickly turned to leave, but the echo of that voice followed me, bouncing off the walls, and I felt the weight of it pressing down on me. I rushed back to the storage room, where the conveyor belt ran, trying to shake off the feeling that something was watching me. But when I returned, I couldn't ignore the odd sensation in the air. The place felt different, like the factory had changed in some subtle way. The machines hummed louder, and the room seemed colder, even though it was the middle of summer. I couldn't explain it, but I had a sinking feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. It was around 2 a.m. when the first strange event occurred. The place was as quiet as it always was at that time of night. No one else was working except me, and the factory had its usual air of abandonment. The conveyor belt hummed steadily, and the dim lights flickered occasionally, casting long shadows across the warehouse floor. I was focused on my task, trying to keep the line running smoothly, when I noticed something odd. One of the old machines at the far end of the room, a rusted press that hadn't been used in years, had started to move. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I looked closer, I saw that the large mechanical arm on the press was shifting slightly, as if being operated by some unseen hand. The movement was slow and deliberate, and the sound it made, a low, grinding whir, was unnervingly loud in the otherwise silent room. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what I was seeing. The machine was supposed to be out of order, its power long disconnected. It had been sitting in that same position for as long as I had worked there. But now, it seemed to be coming to life on its own. The press shifted again, and the grinding sound grew louder. I felt my pulse quicken. I stood there, staring at the machine, my mind racing. Maybe it was just an old piece of equipment malfunctioning. Or maybe it was the wind or the vibrations from the factory settling. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. There was something undeniably wrong about it. I took a cautious step toward the machine, heart pounding, but as I moved closer, the movement stopped abruptly. Everything fell silent. I waited, staring at the machine, but it remained still. My breath caught in my throat. I should have been relieved that it had stopped moving, but instead, a feeling of dread washed over me. I turned back to the conveyor belt, trying to shake off the eerie sensation that had settled in my chest. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen. The next few days, I tried to tell myself that it was just my imagination, or that I had been overly tired. After all, I was working long hours, and it was easy to get lost in the repetitive motions of the job. But the memory of the machine shifting on its own kept replaying in my mind, and I couldn't ignore it. As the days went by, the strange occurrences began to multiply. It wasn't just the machines anymore. There were other things, small things, at first that made me question my sanity. One night, I found a door that I was certain had been locked when I started my shift wide open, its hinges creaking in the breeze. It led to a storage room that no one ever used, filled with old parts and equipment. The room was dark, and the air felt thick and stagnant, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. I checked the lock, and it was still functional, but the door had been left ajar. Another time, I was walking down the hallway toward the break room when I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. Just the same empty hallway stretching out behind me, lit only by the dim overhead lights. It was odd, but I tried to dismiss it. The building was old, and it was easy to hear things: old pipes, creaky floors, the wind rattling the windows. Still, the footsteps had sounded too real to ignore. I mentioned these incidents to the other workers, but none of them seemed particularly concerned. They all shrugged it off as just the quirks of an old building, the kind of strange noises that came with age and wear. They told me not to worry about it, that I was probably just overthinking things. I wanted to believe them. After all, they'd been working here much longer than I had. But something inside me knew that there was more to it than that. Then came the night when things really started to escalate. It was the end of my shift, just as I was preparing to leave. I always did a final check of the building before locking up, making sure everything was in order. As I walked through the halls, I noticed something new. The temperature had dropped drastically. It was as if someone had turned on an industrial-sized freezer somewhere in the building. The air was frigid, biting at my skin as I made my way through the long corridor. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and pressed on, but the chill seemed to follow me. As I reached the end of the hall, I glanced into one of the old offices that had long been abandoned. The door was slightly open, and inside, I saw something that made my stomach lurch. A chair that had been overturned days ago was now sitting upright, facing the desk. And on the desk, right in the center, was a small pile of dust, only it wasn't dust anymore. It looked like ashes. I walked over, my heart racing, and reached for the pile. As soon as my fingers brushed it, I felt a cold rush of air whip past me, and the door to the office slammed shut with a force that sent me stumbling back. I stood frozen for a moment, my mind struggling to make sense of what had just happened. I had to get out of there. I didn't know what was happening, but I couldn't stay in the factory any longer. I quickly made my way to the front door, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. When I finally stepped outside, the cool night air hit my face like a relief, and I rushed to my car without looking back. The next morning, I tried to brush it off. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I had been tired and worked up. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that something was wrong with that place. Something I couldn't explain. And it wasn't just the machines or the odd happenings. It was a feeling, an overwhelming sense of being watched, like the factory itself was alive, waiting, listening, and perhaps even aware of my every move. I didn't know what to do. I needed the job, but I also couldn't ignore the strange things happening around me. I was trapped in a cycle of fear and desperation, unsure of whether I should leave or stay. But deep down, I knew that I couldn't keep ignoring what was happening. Something darker was at play here, and the factory was hiding its secrets. Secrets that I had yet to uncover. The nights that followed the strange incidents became increasingly unbearable. What had begun as isolated, subtle occurrences now started to intensify. At first, I couldn't believe it. Everything that happened seemed like something I could explain away. But with each passing night, The events became more frequent, more disturbing, until I found myself dreading the moment I had to step into that factory. One evening, I arrived for my shift, already dreading the night ahead. The chill I had felt in the halls the previous week still lingered in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I forced myself to push the thought aside and went straight to the production line, focusing on the task at hand. But that didn't last long. As I walked through the factory, I could hear faint sounds in the distance, echoes of voices. At first, I thought I was hearing things, but then it came again, soft, unintelligible whispers, as if a conversation was taking place far away, in the depths of the building. I paused, straining to listen, but the voices disappeared as quickly as they had appeared. The factory had always been a silent, hollow place, and now it felt alive. My heart raced as I scanned the room. There was no one there. It was just me, alone with the machines and the cold, empty space. But that feeling of being watched was overwhelming, like eyes were boring into the back of my skull. I tried to dismiss it. After all, I was used to the factory's strange quirks by now. But then, something else happened. I was walking down the narrow hallway toward the break room when I felt a sudden gust of wind. The air was freezing, far colder than it should have been. My breath became visible in the air, and I could hear the faint sound of doors creaking open and shut. It was as if the factory was alive, breathing, sighing in the darkness. I turned the corner and found the source of the cold. The heavy metal door to the storage room, the one that led into the farthest corner of the building, was wide open. I hadn't seen anyone go in there. I wasn't about to go investigate, not after what I had already experienced, but my curiosity got the better of me. I stepped closer, holding my breath as I peered into the room. The light from the hallway barely reached the farthest corners of the storage area. There were shelves upon shelves of forgotten equipment, boxes covered in dust. But what really caught my attention was the strange reflection I saw in the corner of the room, or a shadow, long and twisted, creeping across the floor, as though it had a life of its own. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. There was no one there, no movement, but the shadow continued to stretch and contort, flickering in the dim light. My stomach twisted with unease, and I quickly backed away, shutting the door with a force that felt like it might echo through the building. But the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger. The factory seemed to hum with an unsettling energy, a presence that I couldn't escape. As the days passed, the strange occurrences only grew more frequent. One night, as I walked through the production floor, I noticed something odd about the machines. One of the presses, the same one I had seen move on its own earlier, was running again. The clanking metallic sounds were sharp and rhythmic, but there was no one operating it. I approached cautiously, my heart racing as I realized that the power to the machine had been turned off. But it was running, and it wasn't stopping. I reached for the emergency shoot-off switch and pulled it, but the machine continued to move, its gears grinding loudly, as if mocking my efforts to control it. I quickly stepped back, panic starting to bubble up inside me. The machine finally stopped, as though it had been waiting for me to back off. It was as if the factory had decided to toy with me, pushing me to the edge of sanity. I checked the machine settings. Everything seemed normal, the power was off, and yet it had moved on its own. It didn't make sense, and the more I thought about it, the more I began to question what I was experiencing. I wasn't the only one who had begun to notice the strangeness. Over the next week, a few of the other employees started to express concerns. I overheard a conversation between two workers in the break room about strange noises they had heard late at night, whispers, clanking, the sound of footsteps echoing through the halls when no one was there. One of them even mentioned that the lights had started flickering, like something was interfering with the power supply. But everyone just shrugged it off, claiming that the building was old, that it had quirks, that it was just a normal part of working in a place like this. But I knew it wasn't normal. The factory was changing. It wasn't the same place I had walked into just a month ago. There was something wrong with it, something dark and sinister that was seeping into every corner. I couldn't stop thinking about the cold I had felt in the hallways, the shadows that seemed to move on their own. It was as if the factory itself had become a living thing, feeding off my fear, watching my every move. And it was getting harder to ignore. The more I tried to investigate, the more I realized how little I knew about the place. The factory had been abandoned for years before I arrived. Who had worked there before? What had happened here all those years ago? I had no answers, only more questions, and the answers I sought seemed to slip further away with each passing day. One night, after my shift ended, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to search the building to find out what was going on. I grabbed a flashlight and began making my way through the darkened factory. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind made my skin crawl. The air felt heavier now, thick with anticipation. I walked past the machines, past the storage rooms, and into the depths of the factory that I had never dared to explore before. I found myself in a long, dimly lit corridor I had never seen before. It felt like it went on forever, stretching out into the unknown. The walls were lined with old, rusted pipes, and the air was thick with dust and decay. I walked slowly, my flashlight flickering in the darkness, illuminating only small sections of the space. It was then that I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I whipped around, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty, silent, save for the hum of the factory in the distance. I stood there, my breath quickening, unsure of whether to turn back or press forward. The footsteps had been real, though. I had heard them, felt them. They were coming from somewhere, from the darkness. I took another step forward, my flashlight shaking in my hand. And then I saw it. At the end of the hallway, in the farthest corner, there was a door. I had never seen it before. It was old, its wood warped and cracked, but it stood there as if waiting for me. And beyond that door, I knew, was something that would answer all of my questions. But I wasn't sure I wanted to know the truth. I took a deep breath, forced my feet to move, and approached the door. It was time to face whatever was hiding in this place, to finally uncover the truth. But what I found behind that door, well, that would change everything. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing through the dark hallway. My heart thudded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. There was something heavy in the air, a sense of foreboding that I couldn't shake, no matter how much I tried to tell myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But as I stepped through the threshold, all doubts vanished. I was no longer in the world I knew. I had crossed into something darker, something far more terrifying than I could have imagined. The room was vast, larger than I could have guessed from the outside. Dim, flickering lights hung from the ceiling, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own, shifting and stretching like living things. The air was thick with dust, and the smell was overwhelming like old metal, rust, and something else. Something foul, like decay. The walls were covered in strange symbols, scratched into the surface as if something had carved them in desperation. I could feel the temperature drop the moment I stepped in. The chill from before seemed to intensify, as if the room itself were breathing cold air into my skin. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I shivered despite myself. I took a cautious step forward, my flashlight illuminating only small pockets of the room at a time. And then I saw it. At the far end of the room, against the wall, was an old, decrepit machine. It looked like something out of a nightmare, huge, rusted, and covered in layers of grime. It seemed to pulse with a strange energy, vibrating ever so slightly, as if it were alive. The air around it felt heavy, charged with a force I couldn't explain. I took another step closer, my legs trembling beneath me. The machine seemed to call to me, its presence undeniable. It was as if the factory itself had been built around this thing, as if it had been waiting for me, waiting for someone to find it. And I knew, deep down, that this was the heart of whatever was wrong with this place. But then something happened that stopped me in my tracks. A figure appeared in the corner of my eye. I whipped around, my flashlight shaking in my hand. There, standing in the shadows, was a figure, a person, or at least something that looked like a person. They were tall, thin, with an eerie, unnerving stillness about them. Their face was obscured by darkness, but I could feel their eyes on me, staring through me. I froze, unable to move, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move. It didn't speak. But somehow, I knew it was watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. "Who are you?" I found myself whispering, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. The figure remained silent. And then, in a movement too fast for me to track, it stepped forward, its shadow stretching across the floor toward me. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, my instincts screaming at me to run. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. It was like it had a grip on me, a pull that kept me rooted to the spot. I didn't know whether I should flee or confront it, but something deep inside told me that I had no choice. I had to face whatever this was. "Who or what are you?" I asked again, my voice shaky, but louder now, desperate for some kind of answer. The figure tilted its head, the movement slow and deliberate, almost unnatural. And then, finally, it spoke. "You shouldn't have come," the voice rasped, hollow and cold. It wasn't a voice I recognized. It didn't sound human. It sounded wrong. I took a step back, my mind racing. I couldn't process what was happening. I had come here looking for answers, but now I was standing face to face with something that didn't belong in this world. My stomach twisted in fear, and I couldn't help but wonder if I had made a terrible mistake. I had crossed a line I shouldn't have, and now there was no going back. But just as quickly as the figure had appeared, it faded back into the shadows, leaving nothing but an oppressive silence behind. I stood there, frozen, for what felt like an eternity, my body trembling with fear. And then, as if to answer my question, the machine began to move. It was subtle at first, a low hum filling the room, like the sound of a distant engine starting up. But the hum quickly grew louder, more forceful, vibrating through the floor beneath my feet. The lights flickered again, and the temperature in the room plummeted even further. I could see my breath now, misting in the cold air, and I felt the icy grip of dread tightening around me. The machine started to whir, its gears turning with an unnatural speed, and something deep within it began to glow. A red light pulsed in the center, growing brighter with each passing second, until it was almost blinding. The air in the room seemed to thicken, charged with a palpable energy that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. And then, the ground beneath me shook. I stumbled, falling to my knees as the floor trembled violently. The walls seemed to close in on me, the symbols etched into them glowing with an eerie light. The hum of the machine grew deafening, like the roar of 1,000 engines, vibrating in my chest. I couldn't move, couldn't think. I was paralyzed by fear, my body locked in place as the factory seemed to come alive around me. And then, from the heart of the machine, a voice spoke. Not the figure's voice, but a voice that seemed to come from the machine itself, mechanical, cold, and ancient. "Welcome home," it said, the words echoing through the room. My blood ran cold. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, my stomach turning as I realized what it was saying. It wasn't talking to me, it was talking to someone else. It was talking to whoever had been here before, to whoever had worked here long ago. And then, the machine's glowing light flared, and something began to emerge from it. I couldn't see what it was at first, just a shifting mass of shadows and light, swirling and coalescing into a shape. But as the shape solidified, I saw it for what it was, a creature, not human, not anything I had ever seen before. It was monstrous, its limbs twisted and elongated, its face a grotesque mockery of something alive. It was covered in a sickly, pale skin that seemed to pulse, as though it were alive, breathing. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. This wasn't just a haunted factory. This was something far worse. The creature's eyes locked onto me, and I could feel its gaze pierce through me, like it was reading my soul, understanding every fear, every doubt I had ever had. It took a step forward, its footfalls heavy and slow, but every step it took sent a ripple of terror through my body. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was stare at it, frozen in place. "Run," the voice whispered from the shadows. I woke up gasping for air, my body drenched in sweat, my heart still pounding in my chest, as though I had just sprinted miles. The room I was in felt foreign, unfamiliar. I couldn't make sense of where I was. The walls were bare, the air stale. The faint glow of the morning sun filtered through the cracked blinds, but the comfort it should have brought only added to my unease. It was only after several moments of deep breathing that I realized I wasn't in the factory anymore. The nightmare I had just experienced, no, it couldn't have been real, could it? It felt so vivid, so raw, like I had truly been there, running from something I couldn't comprehend. I sat up, trying to steady myself, trying to convince my mind that I was safe. But the images, the sounds, the feeling of being hunted, they lingered, lurking just beneath the surface of my thoughts. I glanced around the room once more. I was in my apartment, my own space. But it didn't feel like home. The weight of everything I had encountered, everything I had witnessed, felt too heavy to simply shake off. What was real? What was a dream? Was I still part of the nightmare? Questions without answers flooded my mind, and for the first time in a long while, I felt truly alone. The phone on the nightstand vibrated, breaking me from my thoughts. I reached for it, trembling slightly as I saw the name flashing on the screen. It was Tom, one of the only people I had kept in contact with after everything had happened. He had been one of the workers I'd met before I was hired, and he had left the factory the day I began. I had never been sure why, but I'd always felt that he knew something I had never been told. My hand hovered over the phone, unsure whether to answer or not. Something told me that I needed to speak with him, that maybe he could provide the answers I so desperately sought. I pressed the green button, and his voice came through, rough and tired. "Hey, you okay?" I swallowed, my throat dry. I don't know. I don't know if I'm okay, Tom. I keep thinking about that place. The factory. It feels real, but then it doesn't. I don't know if what happened was a dream or if... Tom cut me off. "Listen to me," he said, his voice stern, urgent. "That place is cursed. It's not just the factory. It's the whole area. You've heard the stories, haven't you? The people who worked there, the ones who vanished, the ones who were never heard from again. It's not normal, and you should have stayed away." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean, cursed? What happened to them? Why didn't you ever tell me about this?" Tom let out a deep sigh, and for a moment, I thought he might not answer. But then he spoke again, quieter this time, as though he feared someone might hear him. "It's the machine, man. I don't know how, but it was built to do something, to bring something. People didn't just disappear, they were taken. The factory, it was never meant to be a place of work. It was a trap. The ones who stayed too long, they never came back. And the ones who left, they were never the same. The thing you saw, the one that spoke to you, it's been there for years, waiting. You weren't the first to come looking for answers, and you won't be the last." I sat back, my mind racing. This was far worse than I had thought. I had stumbled into something ancient, something with a life of its own, something that had claimed the souls of countless others. The factory had never been a place of industry. It had always been a place of darkness. And now, it seemed like I was just one more pawn in its twisted game. I can't go back there," I whispered, the thought of setting foot in that place again almost unbearable. Tom's voice softened. "You don't have to, but you have to tell people. You have to make sure this doesn't happen again. The factory has a hold on that town. It always has. People need to know. You need to get out, get away from it all, and make sure no one else falls into the same trap you did." I nodded, though Tom couldn't see me. "I'll figure it out. I don't know how, but I'll do whatever I can to make sure it doesn't hurt anyone else." The conversation ended, but the weight of what he had told me settled heavily in my chest. It wasn't just the physical factory that I had to escape from. It was the memories, the dread, the knowledge that something was still out there, waiting for its next victim. I had survived, but I wasn't sure if I had truly escaped. Days passed in a blur. I did my best to go about my life as if everything were normal. I went to work. I met friends. I did what I could to keep my mind distracted. But every night, as darkness fell, I felt the pull of the factory, its presence in my thoughts growing stronger. I kept seeing the figure, the machine, the creature. It haunted my dreams, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. I reached out to the authorities, trying to report what I had experienced, what I had seen, but they dismissed it. The factory had long been abandoned, they told me. It had been condemned and left to decay. No one had worked there for years. It was nothing more than an old building, a relic of the past. But I knew better. I knew that something far more sinister lay beneath its rotting walls. I couldn't just walk away from this. Not after everything I had seen. I had to keep digging, keep searching for answers. There had to be someone who could help. Someone who had been there before and had survived. Someone who could understand the true horror of what the factory was, of what it had done. But when I tried to reach out to others, I found nothing. No one would speak of it. No one would acknowledge the stories. It was as if the town itself had buried the truth, afraid of what might happen if it ever came to light. Months passed, and eventually I stopped searching. The haunting images began to fade, though they never fully left me. I tried to rebuild my life, tried to live in peace, but the terror of that factory lingered, a shadow that followed me no matter where I went. I've never returned to that place. I don't know if I ever will. But I do know this. Whatever haunted that factory, whatever force had been trapped within those walls, it hasn't disappeared. It's still out there, waiting, and I'm not the only one who knows it. The factory, the nightmare, it all feels like a distant memory now. Time has a strange way of dulling the sharp edges of our most terrifying experiences. It's been years since I last thought about it in such vivid detail. In fact, I used to wonder if everything that happened to me was just a product of a mind broken by fear and stress. Maybe I had misinterpreted the signs, misunderstood the darkness I had felt. It was all so long ago. But some nights, when the world around me is silent and still, I can almost hear the echoes of those chilling moments, the sounds of machinery and footsteps that were never really there. I live a quiet life now. I've moved on, or at least, that's what I tell myself. I try to avoid places that remind me of the factory, places where old, crumbling buildings stand as silent witnesses to horrors long forgotten. I even found a new job, something simple, far removed from the world of industrial nightmares. It wasn't easy at first getting back to normal, trying to pretend like everything was fine. But I kept moving forward, day by day, hoping the memories would fade into the background. Yet, there are times when I still feel a tightness in my chest, a sudden unease when I pass old buildings or hear the faint hum of machinery in the distance. Those are the moments when I realize that the factory never really left me. It followed me like a shadow, always present, always waiting to make its mark. There are nights when I wake up in a cold sweat, my mind racing, my heart pounding in my chest as if I had just run for my life. But when I open my eyes, I find myself in my bed, the darkness of my room stretching out around me, and I realize that I'm safe. But am I? Can any of us truly say that we've escaped the darkness? The truth is, I don't know. I don't know if the factory will ever be truly gone. Maybe it wasn't just the building that was cursed. Maybe it was the land, the place itself, steeped in something ancient and malevolent. There are rumors, stories that I've heard from time to time, whispers from the older folks in town about strange occurrences, about people who have wandered too close to the abandoned site. Some say they've seen figures in the windows, heard strange noises, or felt a presence watching them just out of sight. These stories remind me of my own experiences, and in those moments, I wonder if it's all still out there, waiting for its next victim. But what can I do? What can any of us do against something that refuses to die, something that lives and breathes in the shadows, hidden just beyond the veil of reality? I've told my story, shared my experience with a few close friends, but I know the truth. Most people won't believe me. Most people will brush it off as an overactive imagination, a product of fear and the strange, unsettling atmosphere of an abandoned building. But I know what I felt, I know what I saw, and I know the truth about that place. Maybe that's the hardest part, knowing that I'm one of the few who truly understands what happened. I don't know if anyone will ever be able to put an end to it. The factory is gone, its walls crumbling and forgotten, but what it left behind, what it unleashed, is still there, waiting for someone else to stumble into its grasp. I can only hope that those who come after me will be more prepared, that they will listen to the stories and learn from the mistakes of those who went before them. Sometimes, I wish I had never taken that job. I wish I had never set foot in that factory, never looked beyond its rusted gates. But then I remember the feeling of survival, the thrill of escaping something that should have consumed me. I remember the strange sense of purpose it gave me, the feeling that I had unlocked a mystery that most people would never understand. And in that moment, I realized that some things, some experiences, shape us in ways we can't fully comprehend. They define us, whether we want them to or not. The factory was just a building, but the memories, the fear, the knowledge that something dark and sinister was lurking within its walls, they are what will stay with me forever. And no matter how far I run, no matter how much I try to forget, I know I will never truly escape what happened there. I've come to terms with that. I've learned to live with the memories, the horror, the lingering question of whether I'll ever truly be free of it. I'm not the same person I was before that job, before that factory. And maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it's the price we pay for surviving, for learning the things we aren't supposed to know. So, as I sit here, writing this final entry, I do so with a sense of finality. Not because I've found the answers, but because I've accepted the truth. There are some things in this world that we cannot change. There are forces beyond our understanding, dark and malevolent, that have existed long before us and will continue to exist long after we're gone. And maybe, just maybe, that factory is one of them.